Chapter 1811. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1811. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1811 Unborn. This was exactly what the Oryx King feared. He didn't want for the Oryx to suddenly be forced into a situation where they had no choice but to become the warriors of others. As for Lionel's comments about his cowardice, if such comments could faze him, he would have long since changed his approach to ruling. People who could call themselves kings wouldn't easily change their mind about such things. As for Lionel, his mind had been made up. He had been too nice for far too long. Even disregarding what he had done for the Oryx Kingdom, back when Valiant Heart Mountain was being attacked, it was he who gave them a path to survive. Afterward, he invested a large amount in their development through Elther to ensure that they would take full advantage of their hyper-evolution stage. Those resources were nothing to Lionel now, but to the him of back then, they had practically been everything, and without said resources, how would the Oryx have been able to thrive in the way they had now? None of this even mentioned the fact he had quite literally brought their two most important pillars back to life, or the fact that the only reason they could live such comfortable lives as a member of another race so deep within human domain territory was precisely because of his name and organizations he had helped birth backing them. Even if King Oryx said he wanted to pay back those things in kind, could he even do so? For one, an investment was worth not only the price itself, but also what it was worth to the person receiving it. Let's say that the Oryx King wanted to return the resources Lionel spent on them back then. That process would be akin to giving back a loan without any sort of interest. And to make matters worse, even if the Oryx King did pay this interest, it still wouldn't be enough. Usually, when a person takes a loan, a small interest is applied because the person giving the loan is well off to begin with and most of the risk is on the person receiving the loan. However, in this case, the risk Lionel had taken was just as great. He wasn't some rich tycoon handing over a small percentage of his wealth. He had been akin to a pauper giving up the last few dollars he had on him. The Oryx King, repaying him, would be akin to two dear friends having an agreement, one of whom would invest the last bits of money they had while the latter used it to make it big. Then years later, the friend who had succeeded would turn around as a millionaire, maybe even a billionaire, and return his friend exactly the amount he had originally invested, no more and no less. This alone would already be enough of a slap in the face and a lesson in picking better friends, but the matter was only made worse by the fact that even if the Oryx King was thick-faced enough to do such a thing, he had no way of returning the value of his life and his son's life. That was the shocking truth. Even if he wanted to return the bare minimum, he couldn't. Lionel knew this quite well, and it was precisely why he had run out of patience. If this so-called Oryx King couldn't make a decision even after almost 3 decades, then Lionel would force him to make one. Lionel didn't wait for the Oryx King to respond and simply turned and left. The fact he hadn't attacked, as far as he saw it, was already an act of benevolence. King Oryx's eyes narrowed, but there was nothing he could say. The ultimatum had already been laid, there really wasn't much else to be said. After Lionel's back view vanished, Elther couldn't help but sigh. "He's right, you know, old man." Elther shook his head. "It's been well over 2 decades since you were resurrected. You should have made a choice by now." "It's not as though the circumstances are conventional," King Oryx said lightly. "He wasn't even here. And that's why he's anxious. If he had been here for all 20 years, do you think he would care very much about what help we could provide? You saw how strong he was. Do you think I've been slacking for these last 20 years? The Oryx King's eyes narrowed before he shook his head. "This concerns our entire race. We have no one to rely on but ourselves. We can't allow ourselves to become cannon fodder for others. Plus, I'm getting a bad feeling from this Lionel, a bad feeling that wasn't there before. It's obvious that my patience has revealed something that I wasn't aware of before. It only makes caution all the more important. I don't know what you're talking about, but what I do know is that Lionel had an opportunity to gain a second ability index 20 years ago." The Oryx King frowned. "A second ability index? That's impossible." "It is possible if you eat the egg of an unborn child of a foreign race that spent the last several years being baptized by the vital energies of countless long-dead seventh-dimensional existences. It's even easier when you consider the fact this egg is from a being not of your race, so it wouldn't even technically count as cannibalism. And it's even more enticing when you realize it's an ability index as groundbreaking as shadow sovereignty. The Oryx King's expression flashed. What are you trying to say? I'm trying to say that Lionel entered a Rapax nest where everyone's goal was to gain this ability index, and yet he was the only one who saw those ugly bastards as people and treated that unborn child like an actual unborn child. If you were there, Father, I doubt even you would be benevolent enough to protect this unborn child as though it was no different from an unborn oryx, right? The Oryx King's heart skipped a beat. All this time, his mind was filled with the echoes of the words shadow sovereignty. He hadn't really cared about the unborn child ever since he heard it was a Rapax. Even Oryx looked more human than they did. Would he save that child? Definitely not. What idiot would give up such an overpowered ability index? Chapter 1812. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1812. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1812. You. Lionel entered the tension-filled room once again, his brothers and the girls still glaring at one another. They looked over toward him almost instantly, just like before, but this time they seemed to be able to tell that his mood was the best. Bang! Suddenly, Lionel's palms slammed against the table. Something odd happened in that moment. It was as though Lionel had so perfectly controlled his strength that the table was just on the verge of being shattered to pieces, but not quite there. The result was a wild and eerie vibration that echoed across the room. All right, that's enough pouting, Lionel said, his voice cold. Yuri's eyes narrowed when she looked toward Lionel, but what she didn't expect was for Lionel to suddenly look back toward her with an equally as cold look in his eye. Your sister is my wife now. You're going to have to get over it. If you can't, I won't let you see our children. Not even one of any one of the 27 of them, that I can promise. Aina, who had wanted to say something, was suddenly stunned speechless before she blushed profusely. She couldn't even do her normal routine of asking Lionel who his wife was. She was truly silent for maybe the first time ever. Even Yuri didn't quite know how to react to this. Yuri tried to speak, not quite sure if she should be enraged or not. She had no idea how to even respond to such a thing. Shut up, I'm talking right now. Lionel's gaze flashed with an oppressive violet light and Yuri suddenly felt it down to the depths of her soul. Yuri was a spiritual, this much was obvious. As such, even if she had an opportunity to use a soul protection treasure, she wouldn't feel the need to. Her own personal inheritances and her own skill was more than enough. But it was also precisely due to this that she felt the full brunt of Lionel's oppression, taking her somewhat off guard before she quickly defended herself. But by then, Lionel was already speaking again. Alan. Alan, who had still been engrossed in his panel, even after Lionel started making so much noise, finally looked up. His gaze was calm as he looked toward Lionel. Lionel nudged his head toward Alina. Stop being clueless, she likes you. Alan blinked once and looked toward Alina, who had suddenly blushed down to her chest. And you, Lionel looked toward Alina. Alan is my brother, I know him well. He doesn't view relationships the way normal people do, and he's not very interested in sexual interactions, although he might be willing to do it if that's what you want. If you want to be his partner, you will have to stimulate him in other ways. It's not exactly impossible, most women who've liked him have given up. It'll depend on you whether you care enough to follow through. You should probably make that decision as soon as possible. By the time Lionel had finished his words, Alan had already gone back to his tablet and Alina didn't quite know how to react. She put her head down and blushed harder. Wasn't Lionel a bit too crude? She hadn't even said anything to the girls yet. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately depending on how you looked at things, Lionel wasn't done yet. And you, Lionel looked toward Joyce. Don't start lecturing me, or else I'll show you what my fist can do, Joyce almost growled out. Even though she said this, her face was already red. She just didn't want to be exposed by Lionel like Alina had. Unfortunately for her, Lionel didn't seem to give a damn right now. Didn't I say shut up already? In talking, Joyce suddenly found her next words caught in her throat. It couldn't be said that she knew Lionel exceptionally well, but since when had he been this aggressive? In fact, she had always felt that Lionel was quite passive about a lot of things. He let life come to him, only then did he react. He was very rarely proactive, and he often didn't need to be. But now, he felt different. This guy, Lionel pointed toward Franco, is a bit of a dick. Franco's mouth opened, but nothing came out. In the corner, Gil slapped his thigh, half dying with Milan. The two seemingly found all of this fucking hilarious. It was too good. Joyce's eyes widened with surprise. She didn't expect Lionel to be on her side. He can't keep it in his pants, he chases women for sport, he doesn't know what it means to settle down even though he's already nearing his 40s. As far as I see it, he's practically a defective product. Franco's mouth hung lower. Lionel had never grilled any one of them like this. But why was it that he wasn't mad and even had a smile on his face he couldn't seem to wipe away? You see that smile on his face? Lionel asked Joyce. He's a masochist, through and through. The meaner you are to him, the more he likes it. If you want him, you can have him. So long as you're willing to keep your foot on his neck for the rest of his life. He needs a very, very, very short leash. Joyce covered her mouth, almost forgetting the semi-seriousness of the matter. Why did she find this so amusing? To the side, Gil was practically coughing up a lung. It was hard to tell if he was laughing or if he was going into cardiac arrest. And finally you two, Lionel settled on Yuri and Raj. Yuri was the only one who didn't seem to find any of this amusing at all, but when Lionel spoke, her eyes couldn't help but widen. You're sitting here, glaring at one another, when you have no idea that he died almost a decade ago. You were so mad that you didn't even check on him during that time and are only just now finding out. Chapter 1813. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1813. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1813. Anytime. Lionel knew the underlying problem here. Spirituals had a far different concept of time than humans did, as they lived over 100 times longer. Raj didn't bother to try very hard to convince Yuri of anything, in one part due to his own pride and personality, and another part due to the fact he didn't think she was trying very hard at all. A year was already far too long, let alone a decade. To Raj, this ship had already sailed and had been over for a long time already, and it was only made worse by the last word Yuri had left him with after their last fight. But this was another problem. Spirituals, especially spiritual couples, could read intentions past their own words. Yuri could also read past Raj's intent and see into his soul. So, she had never really been all that enraged, she was just being stubborn. But when Raj made no attempt, she thought that he wasn't trying hard enough, so she wanted him to try more. These two factors, on one side being their difference in how they saw time, and on the other side being how they took words whether at face value or not, had led to such a situation. Obviously, Yuri hadn't discarded her old body and built a new one. This was the very same body she had had long ago, so obviously she hadn't erased her history with Raj. But not only did Raj have no way of knowing that, he also hadn't seen her in almost a decade. Raj had grown up on modern Earth. That kind of time frame was ridiculous. After a decade, you might as well be strangers at that point. It was no wonder the two were so useless in a relationship. It was difficult enough to date a person who didn't share the same cultural background as you, even if you were both human, let alone to date someone who was from a different species altogether. Without a willingness to communicate, they were bound to fail. But luckily for them, Lionel had stopped giving a damn. Yuri didn't think that Lionel would lie about this, and she couldn't help but look toward Raj. Raj, who was still being a bit stubborn, looked away. He thought it would be a bit too corny of him to rely on his death to get a leg up, especially since he was obviously alive and well now. But this reaction only made Yuri more certain that Lionel wasn't lying. Even though she couldn't read Lionel, she could read Raj quite well. All right. Good. Lionel nodded to himself, seemingly feeling satisfied with the silence. Wife. Aina responded subconsciously, causing Lionel to grin. Excellent, Lionel nodded again, leaving Aina blushing once more. What a shameless tactic. Just as Lionel was about to say something more, his eyes narrowed. On cue, Raylion opened the door. By his side, there was Sale, Hephaestus, and Emna. What happened? Lionel asked. There's movement. There'll be an attack launched in about half a day. Half a day? Lionel raised an eyebrow before he smiled. This was the benefit of having such a robust information network. Half a day actually wasn't long to prepare, but given the fact that all of this had likely been done in the utmost secrecy, and the fact the enemies attacking were almost certainly already within their territory, the fact that etching metal could give them a half-day buffer was utterly groundbreaking. It might as well have been akin to seeing the future. Lionel couldn't help but chuckle. In his time in the dimensional verse, he was always on his back foot, always reading and reacting to what was happening instead of being proactive. But now that he had such an organization to fall back on, things just might come easy. Hephaestus, this is for you. Lionel flipped over a palm and a box of pills appeared. He handed it to Hephaestus. These pills will synergize well with your ability index. They were prepared by my lovely wife, so be sure to thank her. Aina was beginning to get exasperated, but it felt like this wasn't the right time to say something. This is for you, Lionel repeated the same action for Raylion. This will be less helpful to you than it is for Hephaestus, and you'll also have to be far more careful. A single one of these forced pills could kill you. You have to be mentally prepared and ready to endure pain. However, if you survive, this will set the foundation for you moving forward. I have something much better in mind for you. It'll just require some time to execute. Raylion solemnly accepted the box, but there was a clear flash of determination in his eye, not dampened by the worry in his wife's eyes. Sale, you have a unique ability index. I've reserved a spot for you in the Midas and Radix family's territory. If you go there, you'll find a surprise and your strength will increase 100-fold, easily. Sale's brows jumped. Her ability index was, indeed, unique. Even with their information network and scanning through trillions upon trillions of people, she had never found a second one like her. Lionel was certain that the complete inheritance of the Silver Empire was almost tailor-made for Sale. She would most definitely thrive from its use, even more so than the Flora family. Here, Lionel handed Sale an 8th-dimensional sapling similar to the one he had given Gray. With just this alone, her strength would increase quite a measure. Sale accepted it solemnly as well, not knowing what to say. In all these years, she had wondered if her husband's faith in Lionel was warranted. But in just a few moments, he had handed over things beyond her wildest imagination. Just the scent of the pills he had given Raylion and Hephaestus were enough to make her tremble. Emna. Lionel sighed somewhat. Your path is your own. I actually think that if I gave you external items now, it would actually hinder you as opposed to help you. You only need a hint of inspiration to cross that final barrier and more battle experience. Less assassination, more upfront, life-threatening clashes. Are you prepared to do that? Emna's gaze flashed with a fierce light and she nodded her head. Any time. The blade force around her seemed to sing. Good. Let's move out, everyone. We're going to crush them all in a single sweep. Chapter 1814. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1814. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1814. Subtle. The activity near the borders of the three-pillar sector was very subtle. In fact, from an outside observer, it was hard to tell that anything out of the norm was happening at all. The trading routes were still moving as usual, tourists still moved in and out as many without families and organizations to rely upon tried to move closer to Earth in hopes of gaining better lives. At the same time, those who had the foresight to see the coming implosion were doing the exact opposite, making their way out to stiller waters. Under all of this normal activity, though, an undercurrent was slowly building momentum. Covertly, several powers began to come together, having been emboldened by the retreat of Shield Cross stars. Although things had been tense before, they had never reached this extent. The power of the shield was far too great, and even those who were greedy had to temper their impulses. However, with the apparent hot-headed and foolish decision of Alienor, these lurking threats became very real threats. How much longer? We still need a few more hours. This is already fast. If we move any faster, we'll expose ourselves and our organization will be lacking. The most important leg of this war will happen right in the beginning. During the first push, we need to claim at least half of the three-pillar sector. We'll need to secure all of the fast lanes toward the Rain Galaxy. A few hours is fine. Of the two speaking, one was the patriarch of the O'Neill family and the other was a patriarch of the Bliss family. They were currently in a warship hangar, waiting for everything to be prepared to move out. Most of their warriors were already boarded and they were just waiting in silence for the signal. There were quite a few families that could control galaxies within the three-pillar sector and the surrounding sectors, and these were just two of them. It could be said that in the grand scheme, they were small fry, but it was also because of this that they would be leading the charge ahead first. It couldn't be helped. As the weak, if they wanted to change their fates, they had to take some risks. It was too dangerous to target families within the three-pillar sector, but from other surrounding sectors, it was much easier. Given the short duration between the disappearance of Shield Cross stars and this attack as well, it was only right that only those that had been corrupted long ago would partake. There wasn't time to convert others. Regardless, this didn't matter to them. As they saw it, Earth was nothing but loose soil. Even their own families warred against one another. With the obstruction of Shield Cross stars, this battle was as good as won. They didn't need to do anything as crazy as conquering the Ascension Empire. Although these few family heads didn't doubt that this was the goal of their superiors, all they wanted was a small piece of the pie. Suddenly. Boom! Without a word, without warning, the entire hangar was eviscerated, wiped from existence as though it had never existed. The chatting patriarchs didn't even register what happened and weren't even aware enough to know that they had just spoken their last words and had their last thoughts. This matter was repeated dozens of times over. Entire armies of the absolute elite wiped out one after another, like clockwork. It all happened so fast that information couldn't even make it back. It was only after news of the chain of explosions was known that the so-called superiors realized that they had actually been preemptively targeted, but none of them could understand how news of this had leaked. Even if one of their allies were traitors, those small fry would at most know their assigned gathering location. Even in the upper echelon, only a very select few who were aware of all of the locations, but all of these individuals had way too much to lose to betray them. If they didn't, they would have never been trusted to begin with. Unfortunately, before these superiors could understand what was happening, an army descended on their location. In an instant, a battle that should have been waged in the three-pillar sector was fought at its borders, the citizens of the Ascension Empire completely oblivious to what was happening. Lionel stood on the bow of his flagship, his gaze sharp. To his left, an unhappy Harmony sighed. But at the moment, she could only obediently be used as a pawn. Lionel seemed to have every intention of making use of her without a care for her status. To his right, there was a slightly skeptical Aina. But seeing the unhappy expression on Harmony's face, she could only choose to trust Lionel. Behind them, the flagship was flooded with warriors prepared to battle. Lionel took a step forward, raising his foot and placing it on the bow of the ship as he peered over. A grin spread across his face as he looked toward the floating asteroids in the distance. At first, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with them, until one took a second look and noticed the sheer number of warships using their flow as camouflage. Going to continue to hide? Lionel's voice echoed through the vastness of space, rumbling like thunder. It was enough to make the weak feel as though he was squeezing their hearts in his palm. Ah, seems like they don't want to come out. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar sneered with disdain from Lionel's shoulder, waving his little claws. The simple action sent a surge of pressure through the void, causing the rock face of an asteroid in the distance to explode and send shrapnel in all directions. The warship that had been hiding behind it was pelted and instantly became riddled with holes. It barely managed to hold on. Harmony, why don't you go greet our guests for us? Lionel asked with a smile. Harmony grit her teeth, floating up from the flagship. These people would be very unlucky on this day. She needed someone to vent her frustration on. Chapter 18:15. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 18:15. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 18:15. Coincidence? Harmony vanished and appeared within the depths of the asteroid belt almost instantly. She crossed the seemingly impossible distance with absolute ease. In a flash, her scythe appeared in her hands and she let out a shriek as she slashed downward. She rampaged about with an unearthed fury. Every time she slashed, rocks would shatter and warships would collapse one after another. It didn't seem as though anything could withstand even a single one of her attacks. A light cough echoed to Lionel's back. "Where'd you find this one, Cap?" Gil mumbled. "She's my type, why don't you introduce me?" Milan suddenly spoke, wiping his drool away with a forearm. "Look at her, she could snap you like a twig." "Get yourself together, you're embarrassing," Gil replied quite fiercely, despite the fact it was clear he couldn't take his eyes off of the sway of Harmony's hips. They couldn't ogle Aina out of respect for Lionel and because they cared dearly for their lives, but the moment they saw a woman comparable to her, their eyes didn't seem to want to function properly, even threatening to pop out of their eye sockets. "She can snap me like a twig all she wants," Milan replied. Joel, Drake and Arnold looked toward one another and shook their heads. These brothers of theirs were truly too embarrassing. They saw one beauty and already didn't know how to act. They even looked like they would throw down their gauntlets and fight to death so long as Harmony asked them to do so. "Sure, I can introduce you," Lionel laughed. "She's from the Three-Finger Cult, though." Gil and Milan were suddenly rendered speechless. Since when had they had someone like that on their side? Wait, didn't that also make her an enemy? Lionel was just trying to set them up. She'd sooner stab them to death than date them. The two felt cold shivers run up their spines. Enough. At that moment, a roar came from the asteroid belt. It was all too obvious that their attempt at a covert operation had been entirely thwarted, and even dense networks of traitors they had been building up for the last several years were all wiped out all at once. It could be said that of their cannon fodder, over 90% would never see the light of the next day. Their operation had become a complete failure and they still had no idea just how things had ended up in this way. Even so, all hope was not lost. Even though their covert operation had failed, those that had died were just their vanguard, weak families they had planned to throw forward to distract the Empire from the true and most lethal threat. Ultimately, they had expected most of those families, if not all, to die regardless. It was just a shame that they couldn't do any damage before then. However, if this was used correctly, Earth and the Ascension Empire would only suffer a greater loss. They had just wiped out countless families without word or warning. This sort of unilateral movement and decision was exactly the kind of thing that would put Earth in a more precarious situation. Right then, the person who had just spoken shot up from the center of the hidden formation of warships. He wore silver and radiant blue armor, his hair just as blue as the sparks of lightning that danced across his armor as well. With his spear in hand, he truly did seem to be a deity incarnate, a feeling only made all the more dominating by his seventh-dimensional aura. Lionel didn't need to think much to know who this was. This was none other than the man in control of the Thrusting Skies sector, Patriarch Alec, head of the Skies family and one of the greatest threats Earth currently faced. He seemed to want to end this battle swiftly as possible as almost the moment he spoke out, roaring to cover the region in his aura. Then, she struck out with lightning swiftness, the tip of his blade appearing before Harmony in a single breath. Harmony felt oppressed by the aura of a seventh-dimensional existence for only a moment before she blinked and vanished, appearing on the bow of the flagship in an instant. She was already well outside the range of the attack before it could even build up momentum, let alone land on her. The attack rebounded against the barrier of the flagship and caused a slight ripple. Lionel could only shake his head toward this sight. Before his interaction with that eighth-dimensional expert from S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Stars, such an attack wouldn't have even caused the barrier to waver. Unfortunately, he hadn't found a workaround for the nerf yet. he would have to strengthen his mind further before he could use his internal sight to check on the fusion core and modify it. Even so, the strength it had access to now was enough for him to do what he needed to do. Your attack is quite ferocious, Patriarch Skies, but don't you think you're wasting time here? Lionel asked lightly, his expression still quite a bit casual. Alex Skies, who wanted to make a follow-up attack after seeing that the flagship wasn't invulnerable, suddenly paused. His gaze narrowed as he locked onto Lionel. What are you talking about? Isn't it obvious? How do you think we knew about your location? What about the location of the cannon fodder you had so painstakingly prepared? Alex's pupils constricted. What are you trying to say? I don't know, don't you think that it's just a bit convenient? Of all the important points to gather upon, it was the Rain Galaxy that was chosen. And beyond that, the support you have coming from the outside is the chaotic water sector, right? A nice coincidence, don't you think? Alec was intelligent enough to understand what Lionel meant almost instantly. The chaotic water sector and the Rain Galaxy both specialized in water force. Could this have been planned by the chaotic water sector long ago? Chapter 1816. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1816. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1816. Thrumdalek suddenly sneered. Did this Lionel take him for a fool? Just how common were the core elemental affinities? Water, fire, earth and wind, you could find them everywhere. He could name a dozen other galaxies just like the Rain Galaxy off of the top of his head. This didn't mean that they all had connections with the chaotic water sector, right? And also, even if he was willing to accept this, what good would betraying their own operation do for the chaotic water sector? If Earth wasn't weakened because it was prepared for the outcome of this sneak attack, then the chaotic water sector would not only lose its strongest allies, when the time came, they would have to face Earth alone. To make matters worse, the original reason why the chaotic water sector wanted to get out in front of this was because they knew that when Earth finished expanding, its competition would only become fiercer. Those large families were still waiting in the wings under the guise of decorum and the greater good, but they all understood how the world worked. The moment the benefits became too great to ignore, the so-called greater good and its ideals would fly out the window. Unless they could all get their footholds now, they didn't stand a chance in fighting against those families in the future. This was their chance. Here and now. So why would the chaotic water sector ruin that? How ridiculous. Oh, you're doubting me? Lionel chuckled. How did I pinpoint your location, then? That's enough, Alec said coldly. Alec wasn't 100% certain, but he had heard rumors of the Ascension Empire's emperor being capable of using his lineage factor to view every aspect of his territory. Although they had believed that this was nonsense, which was why they had moved forward with their plans anyway, this seemed to be the only explanation for what was happening here. In that case, then covert operations would always be their downfall. The only method forward was to suffocate Earth with raw strength. First he would retreat from here, regroup, and then launch an all-out assault when their strength was all in order. The best plan was one the enemy could see coming, and yet couldn't stop anyway. Even if he was wrong, Alec had no intention of making such a decision here. Lionel shook his head and laughed again. Those that could become the heads of such powerful organizations weren't fools. Even if Alec didn't know the truth, that didn't mean that he would so easily accept Lionel's characterization of events. He would instead choose to investigate on his own. Just like the best schemes were the ones others could see coming and yet couldn't stop, the best lies were the ones an enemy convinced themselves of first. It's fine if you don't want to listen to me. But ultimately, you should think about it. You're looking at things through a narrow lens. Some people are looking beyond just the human domain. The moment Lionel said these words, Alec's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the words that Lionel had just spoken were so frighteningly heavy that he didn't even want to think about them. He immediately turned and wanted to retreat. Wait a minute now, I still can't let you leave. If I did, wouldn't people think they can just choose to attack my Ascension Empire whenever they wanted? Alec sneered. Obviously, he believed that everything Lionel had said before this was bullshit now. If Lionel was really so certain that he would find some dirt on the patriarch of the chaotic water sector, then it would be in his best interest that Alec be released with as much strength as possible. That way, when the two sectors clashed, they would be able to harm one another sufficiently. But when Alec looked into Lionel's eyes, all he saw was the indifferent smile of someone with everything in the palm of his hands. Lionel's thoughts were on a level even seventh-dimensional existences couldn't fathom. If Alec thought he could see through him so easily, there would be nothing but disappointment waiting for him at the end of it all. "Well, wipe out half of their fleet, then let them go," Lionel said lightly. Alex suddenly raised his head to the skies, laughing uproariously. However, right then, a voice appeared to Lionel's side. "Yes, Emperor." The booming cadence of the voice caused the void to tremble. At that moment, a familiar big-bellied man appeared. He was none other than the overseer of the asteroid convenience station. Since his death, he had been stored within Lionel's snow globe, and now he would have a final battle before his soul dispersed. Lionel pushed off the bow of the flagship, a surfboard appearing beneath his feet as he shuttled through the air with untold speed. "Attack," he said coldly. The big-bellied man, weight valiant violet armor, soared after Lionel quickly before appearing high above his head and slapping his belly twice. His chest expanded and his diaphragm seemed to explode in size. Then he unleashed a mighty roar. The sound wave crushed everything in its path. Alec's eyes widened and he quickly raised his spear to counter. At that moment, though, Lionel, who had been riding his sleek black surfboard across the starry skies, had already come to a halt, a dark gold panda construct appearing around him, its 6 arms each forming a different sign. Lionel's kidneys thrummed with life, his scarlet star node surging as a violent surge of crimson gold force manifested in the surroundings. Watching the snaking fire force take the form of dozens of coiling flood dragons, sparkling brighter than even the stars that were their backdrop, Harmony's pupils constricted. She had already written off Lionel's victory against her as being due to the pressure she had experienced being in Earth's territory, while it was Lionel's home turf to begin with. But seeing this, she couldn't help but wonder exactly how much Lionel had also held back in their fight. Roar! The dozens of flood dragons surged forward. All they knew was destruction, laying to waste everything in their vicinity as Patriarch Alec was held down by his spirit construct. Chapter 1817. Published at 27th of April 2023 9:04 and 58 seconds AM. Chapter 1817. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1817. The best scheme. Lionel sat in silent meditation, his legs crossed and his palms resting on his thighs. In his mind, the battlefield was reflected with absolute perfection. He controlled dozens of fire flood dragons and his spirit construct all at once, and yet his face seemed to be absolutely relaxed. The warriors hidden within the flagship reacted all at once, surging forward like a tidal wave. "Boy!" Alec's voice boomed as he shot toward Lionel, but every attempt he made, he found himself entirely obstructed. The worst part of it all was that every time he tried to attack the big-bellied spirit construct with his spear force would vanish entirely. He remembered being warned that his spear force would be useless against Lionel, but he had never taken this seriously. Why would he? He could kill the likes of Lionel with a single finger. Why would he need to use his spear force in the first place? However, he had never considered the fact that Lionel would have the ability to extend his ability like this. Toward this, Lionel sneered inwardly. In the past, spear force had to touch him to disperse. But now, he had his absolute spear domain. Within his domain, anyone who wanted to use spear force was living out a dream. Alec began to panic. If it wasn't for the current setting, the situation wouldn't have been so bad. However, because the plan was for them to hide within the asteroid belt, their maneuverability was almost non-existent at this moment. Not only was their usual formation impossible to use, but just escaping was nigh impossible. Lionel obviously knew this, which was why he had only come with the flagship. He never planned to attack with it at all. Instead, he sent forward individual warriors who could maneuver around the asteroids with far greater ease than the large warships could. The strategic advantage was suffocating. It felt like he was being outplayed in all facets. What infuriated him the most was that Lionel didn't even open his eyes to look at him anymore. He simply continued his slaughter. No, he's not just controlling those flame constructs, he's also moving the asteroids to give his people even more of an advantage. It was hard to notice at first because Lionel wasn't causing large reactions, and the asteroids were moving around to begin with. But when Alec began to calm down and analyze the situation so that he could find the best method of escape to minimize the losses, he realized what was happening. Alec's expression couldn't help but become incomparably ugly. Was this the power of a sixth-dimensional existence could have? Some of those asteroids were several kilometers across and their distance apart was incredibly vast. Although Lionel was only giving them small nudges here and there, this was a feat that even most seventh-dimensional Earth Force experts couldn't replicate. Monster. Alec's blood went absolutely ice-cold. He only realized now what kind of existence he was facing off against. If Lionel made it to the seventh dimension, would it even be possible for those beneath the eighth dimension to even threaten him? Alec's mind couldn't help but flash to another urban legend. Velasco Morales. Could it be that the Morales family was about to produce another undefeatable existence in just as many generations? Roar. The dozens of snaking Scarlet Star Force flood dragons roared out all at once, their eyes opening to reveal reflective violet irises and their bodies becoming even more corporeal and solid. Their long necks raised into the skies, their bodies expanding as they took deep breaths. At that moment, they looked like the true beasts of legend, plucked right out of their mythos and drawn across the starry skies with a menacing aura. Their breaths came to a stop all at once and Lionel's eyes suddenly flashed open with a cold light. No! Alec called out. It was too late. Balls of fire dozens of meters across formed one after another and each flood dragon breathed out, unleashing carnage everywhere their breath of crimson and gold passed. The sheer destructive ability of fifth-dimensional Scarlet Star Force scorched the skies, burned the eyes and trembled the heart. Warships that had been through dozens of wars, hundreds of battles, and thousands of injuries were turned to molten metal in a mere instant. The palms of Lionel's dark gold panda construct opened up and the flood dragon constructs vanished. But even more quickly than that, the motes of flames that remained in the skies quickly formed into majestic mage arts. Magic circles so complex one's head spun just looking at them were created one after another. Within his ethereal glabella, Lionel's mana core rustles, its countless leaves dancing with a delicate light. Compared to the commotion happening outside, it was incomparably calm, its runes lighting up one after another. Back outside, the starry skies trembled as the aura of destruction continued to increase. Space whined and twisted, force collapsed before it could form, weaker constructs began to collapse from the outside and before the spell even descended. Countless spears appeared in the air, each marked with a crown of royalty around their polearms. Lionel slowly pressed his palms together before opening them up and pressing outward. His irises danced with a malevolent light and the spears in the skies stopped trembling all at once, an eerie silence fell over. Meeting Alec's gaze, Lionel smiled lightly. "Destroy," he said lightly. The spears descended. Like an imperial edict, they wiped out everything in their path, shattering them, grinding them, burning them, sundering them ashes. Flashes of light brighter than even the starry skies boomed across the battlefield. Before the destruction was even concluded, Lionel slowly stood to his feet, allowing his panda construct to vanish. "Retreat," he said evenly. Lionel turned back, ready to return to the flagship, but his steps suddenly paused. "Oh, right," Lionel smiled as he looked back toward Alec, who was entirely pale-faced. He could only watch as his people were destroyed one after another. "You might want to think of an adequate explanation for why you were the only seventh-dimensional existence here," Lionel said with a laugh. "Good luck, I hope they believe you." Alec's eyes opened wide. He was the only seventh-dimensional existence here because it was the smart choice. Between the chaotic water sector, the Viola family, and his thrust skies sector, he was in the most vulnerable position. The Viola family already shared a sector with Earth and their foothold was strong. In fact, in Alec's opinion, he felt that they were quite greedy to participate in this to begin with. The chaotic water sect was outside of Earth's territory, so the pressure on them was nigh non-existence, They were only here to prepare for the future. Only his family was caught in an awkward in-between. They were both within Earth's territory, and yet not close enough to maximize all benefits. Their hands were practically forced. Due to this, he chose to be cautious and left a lot of their fight power back in their sector. But the trouble was that this wasn't the original agreement and he had acted on his own. He had thought the ask to bring more than just himself was asinine, so he sneered at the request and did this instead. He hadn't thought much of it before because he was certain this operation would succeed, until it suddenly didn't. Never had Alec expected that all this time, while it seemed that Lionel was trying to sow doubt in him toward his allies, it would actually end in Lionel making his allies doubt his thrusting skies sector instead. Alec trembled and nearly suffered a fatal blow from the spirit construct. The best scheme was one you knew was a scheme and yet could do nothing about it. If Alec wanted to stop himself from being targeted by the Viola and the chaotic water sector, the only path forward was to give a good reason for his actions, a reason that Lionel had already given him. The only path ahead was to divert blame. Suddenly, the connection between the chaotic water sect and the Rain Galaxy looked more and more obvious to him. Alec watched Lionel's back get further and further away, clenching his fists so hard that his fingers dripped with blood. Chapter 1818. Published at 5th of May 2023 8:29 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 1818. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1818. Important. Alec took deep breaths. About halfway through the fight, he had begun to wonder why it was that Lionel had chosen him out of everyone. Logically, his position was the most covert of them all, and the most difficult to pick out. If he could find out about his location, then finding the position of the chaotic water sector and the Viola family would be even easier. But that was just one aspect. Just as logically, the Skies family had been in the least compromising position. They were the most out of the way. The threat posed was the lowest. Only now did Alec understand that Lionel had done all of this on purpose. All of those points would only further count against him. He could imagine it now, the questioning looks he wouldn't have the answer for. He felt entirely helpless. Who would believe that a prince who had impulsively killed 4 of Earth's strongest families could bide his time and scheme like this as well? Alec almost believed that Lionel had actually killed off those families as a convenient veil for his true self. There was even news that Lionel had just as impulsively charged into Viola territory. Although it had been exposed that that was a clone, everyone believed that only a clone of the highest quality would be so good. Considering the resources it would take to create such a clone, they still assigned impulsivity to that action, although Lionel ultimately didn't die. Of course, they had no idea that that clone had cost Lionel nothing but the corpse of an enemy, as they had no idea how his lineage factor worked, nor had the world learned of his emulation spatial force innate node yet. The more Alec thought about it, the more he felt like he was stepping into an intricate web laid out by Lionel, a web that if he took just a single wrong step in, he would find himself trapped within and slowly bled until he simply had nothing left. And the more Alec thought like this, the more nigh mythical Lionel's existence became in his mind and the more suffocated he felt. Suddenly, he felt like the only way to survive was to, indeed, do as Lionel had said. Lionel exhaled his own breath, but it had little to do with nervousness or even fatigue. He simply had some thoughts that he wanted to organize and a feeling deep within him that he felt that he clicked with. Just now was the first time he had used his dream force since his sudden enlightenment, or more accurately, it was at least the first time he had done so to actively attack and not just passively within his own head. And the feeling had been quite magical, despite the fact he had only used it as a secondary supposed force to his emulation dream force. Those flood dragons he had formed back then had been constructed with the Luxnix family force art system, or more accurately, the force art system of the Northern Star Lightstar elemental lineage factor. This was the very force art that could be comprehended through the tablets. From Lionel's comprehension, that force art system was exceptionally good at creating constructs, creations that felt almost like living, breathing existences. It gave the force arts more flexibility, but at the same time they tapped into the artistic conception of the beasts they embodied, pulling power from them. The flood dragons that Lionel created mostly came from his mother. Lionel had chosen a humanoid construct for his king's might, but his mother had chosen a dragon for her emperor's might. He hadn't heard of dragons actually existing outside of myths and legends, and that was even after reading through everything within the Void Palace. In fact, dragons seemed to be a creation of Earth's mythos in specific. As Earth's world spirit holder, Lionel believed his mother likely had a special connection to the mythos of Earth in specific, which was why she was able to create such lifelike versions and even base her emperor's might construct on it. This aside, Lionel had only gotten an inkling from techniques his mother had left behind for him back when he first came to the Luxnix family, and he often liked creating attacks based on them, although he was aware his conception would always be far off from his mother's. But this time, something had changed. Rather than chasing after his mother's conception of dragons, he veered from it and somewhat created his own, basing it not on some mythology of dragons, but rather upon what he personally thought they should embody. As he was doing it, the Force Art system, which should have been formed entirely of his Scarlet Star Force at the time, naturally incorporated his emulation spatial force and even his king's might at the same time. His emulation spatial force relied on his dream force to make the flood dragons more real than they had ever been, even to the point that they roared like real beasts. At the same time, they had gained violet eyes that looked almost exactly like Lionel's own. He even vaguely felt that he could have seen through their perspective if he had really wanted. When those eyes were formed, it was as though they were no longer constructs and had truly become beasts. The carnage they wrought was on a completely different level, and the power output was maximized when the stamina requirements on his part for an equivalent level of devastation had been minimized. It was an extremely magical feeling, almost as though he was truly breathing life, giving life, creating life. It was like he was a god forging the world into his image, and he had said, "Let there be dragons." The Northern Star lineage factors had always had an underlying reliance on the mind and thus dream force. No matter which evolution of the lineage factors you were at, there was always an aspect that influenced the mind directly, and now Lionel felt that he had found a connection between this and his dream force that allowed his comprehension of the Force Art system to soar. And it was all because of a small improvement in his force manipulation standards. Lionel had already known before, but now he knew better than ever just how important force manipulation was to personal strength. Chapter 1819. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:38 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 1819, Imagination. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. What? Richard frowned for the first time in as long as he could remember. He couldn't remember having ever had a fluctuation in his emotions in recent years, at least not one that was large enough to show so prominently. He had gone through too much in the last several years. The destruction of his family, countless humiliations in the Void Palace, being swallowed up by that zone, the death of his last remaining family member and brother, there wasn't enough to make him frown these days. But this was a bit much. The news seemed to come one after another, but the most frustrating part was that it wasn't coming through the channels it should have. Rather than their own people reporting back saying that they had been attacked, they had been wiped out so fast that they couldn't even do that. Instead, Richard was reaching reports from miscellaneous businesses of his and the Viola family that had been in the general area, who were only contacting him to let him know that business would likely be slow for the next coming weeks due to the commotion. After all, tourists wouldn't be in a happy, buying mood if their tourist destination had suddenly become a war zone. And yet, even after several such businesses contacted Richard and the Viola family about this matter, likely all afraid that they would be accused of embezzling funds if they didn't do so, there was still not a word from the actual alliances of this coming war. And then it came. The first to contact him was Alex Skies. The patriarch of the thrusting Skies sector was absolutely furious. Richard could hear the thunder booming in the background and the strikes of lightning spilling about. He had immediately accused one of them of setting him up. Richard could hardly get a word in, not because Alec was so overwhelming to him, but because he was absolutely shocked to find out that half of Alec's fleet had been wiped out. After Richard regained his bearings, smoothed out his frown and took a breath, his aura changed. That's enough. The ice cold of his voice cut the Skies family patriarch off completely, stifling all of his momentum. Even the sounds of thunder and lightning on the other side seemed to have been quelled. What reasons do you have for suspecting us? Isn't the result enough? Alex said coldly, Do you think I just imagined half of my fleet being wiped out? My Sky's family location was in the most covert region there was, but it was also in the region most susceptible to an ambush. How could we even maneuver in those asteroid fields? We relied entirely on this information being airtight, and yet somehow we were the ones to suffer. I also can't help but tell by your tone and surprise that obviously you weren't attacked. Am I supposed to take that as a coincidence? Richard didn't seem to take this accusation very seriously at all. Instead, he flipped over a palm. According to my information, the only seventh-dimensional existence who followed the fleet was you and you alone. By all rights, the one with the most odd actions was yourself. This was supposed to be an all-out assault. Did you expect to deal Earth a blow with nothing but a horde of sixth-dimensional existences? Or maybe you didn't plan on dealing them a blow at all? What, did you want to play both sides? Exposing our allies and pretending to have been hurt yourself as well to get off scot-free? After saying all of this, Richard expected something very different from the other side than what he actually expected. He wanted to hear a flustered response, a disorganized rambling, a man on his back foot, but instead all he got was a laugh and a sneer. Aren't my actions perfectly justified judging by what actually happened? If I had brought out my full team, wouldn't I be finished? You mighty Viola and warriors of the chaotic water sector might be able to afford the loss of nothing but a horde of sixth-dimensional existences, but my Sky's family cannot. They were our future. And many of them had potential to reach greater heights. I'm not going to sit here and try to justify myself to a person who didn't suffer even a single loss. Richard fell into silence, his expression unreadable. What reason would I have to betray you? Richard finally asked. Do you have any idea how much I loathe the Ascension Empire? What they've done to me? If you want to make up a story, at least make it make sense. Unexpectedly, Alec only continued to sneer. I've known from the beginning that you were in this for nothing more than a personal vendetta. You are the most untrustworthy kind of ally because you move with your heart instead of your head. Even if I had told you the information I had previously, you would have still gone ahead and did this. Richard paused before biting. What are you talking about? The goals of the chaotic water sector are not the same as ours. In fact, I suspect that they're being pulled along by the cloud race, using them to dictate their actions. Their ultimate goal isn't to defeat Earth in this round. What they want is Earth to become public enemy number one so that the rest of the human domain attacks them at once. You certainly have quite the overactive imagination, Richard replied blandly. And that's exactly the response I would expect to hear, Alex said coldly. Does it make sense for me to simply take your words at face value? If you knew this, why did you still agree to act? Why did I still agree? The Zoltene faith was wiped out, the Imperial Prince made a personal visit to you. Who do you think was next? I had no choice but to try and deal a blow to the Ascension Empire in hopes they wouldn't have time to deal with me, but who would have thought that I would be backstabbed by my own allies first? Chapter 1820. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:38 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 1820. Entangled. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Richard fell into silence once more. What proof do you have? Richard asked. I would advise you to look into the Rain Galaxy, Alex said coldly before directly hanging up. Richard sat in silence for a long while, not saying anything. His mind seemed to go through several iterations and thoughts before he sneered. If Alec had acted flustered when Richard first questioned him, he would have believed him. However, that response was too prepared, too practiced, too ready. He had clearly been ready for the questioning. When someone did something suspicious by coincidence, it wouldn't be at the forefront of their mind. Often they wouldn't even notice the oddity until someone pointed it out to them. For example, let's take a couple in a relationship. If one of them had a habit of always putting their phone face up but one day placed it face down not just once, but a few times in a row, what would they do if their partner confronted them about this? If they had noticed the change in action in themselves, in all likelihood, they would already have a prepared answer. But if they reacted flustered, it would mean that they hadn't thought much about it and would be more likely to be innocent in the matter. This could be the case if the phone of said partner recently got a new case that made it more difficult to pick up while it was face up, so they had gotten into the habit of placing it face down now for easier access. They might have made this choice subconsciously and never really once thought about it. Of course, it would be a shame either way, but most took someone being flustered as a sign of guilt, when this wasn't always the case at all. And that was especially for absolute experts. Richard trusted an expert like Alec who could see this problem coming to be ready with a perfect answer, which meant that he was even more certain that Alec was lying precisely because of said perfect answer. In Richard's mind, this confirmed that Alec had defected. The best lies were marred in truth. Likely, he had felt the pressure from the destruction of the Zoltene faith in just a single day, and that was only compounded by the destruction of the Brazinger, Aderna, Crudis and Lavis families. As such, he chose to exchange information with Earth for safety, and all he had to give up in exchange was some 6-dimensional existences. Richard didn't doubt that the destruction of those warships was real. They wouldn't do this by half measures. So, he didn't even bother to double-check. With a thought, Richard waved a hand and an attendant came into his office. Send a few covert teams to the sites of destruction. If you're caught and questioned, use the businesses as a shield. Say that you heard there was a war and came to protect the businesses from looters. While you're there, focus on gathering as much intel as you can. Report back to me anything interesting you find in 3 days' time. Yes, Patriarch. Is there anything else? The woman asked. Richard was about to wave her away, but he paused for a moment. Although several minutes of this silence passed, the woman didn't dare to disturb his thoughts. Eventually, Richard looked up again with a piercing gaze. Send a team to the Rain Galaxy. The goal this time isn't covert operations, but an all-out seizure. Subdue their family, crush their spirit, and take control of their land. I also want this done within 3 days. Yes. The woman bowed and left quickly. Richard tapped his large oak desk in silence for a moment, seemingly waiting for something. And then, it came. The crystal on his desk buzzed and the face of a familiar man appeared. He was none other than the patriarch of the chaotic water sector, Guerrero's. Guerrero's expression was just as cold and indifferent as Richard's, but deep within his gaze, there was a clear displeasure. I just tried to contact the sky's patriarch, Guerrero said before pausing. He did not respond. Richard's gaze narrowed. Somewhere deep inside, he had assumed that Alec would have put on the same act for the both of them, maybe even telling Guerrero's the same thing he had told him but in reverse. Maybe in the tale he told Guerrero's, it was Richard who was colluding with the cloud race. But the fact that Alec had only contacted him but not Guerrero's was curious. Did he do it on purpose to make Richard second-guess himself, or was there another reason? I assume he didn't want to have to rehash the same accusation twice, Richard said indifferently, repeating much of what Alec had said, only leaving out the matters related to the cloud race. I see, Guerrero's nodded. This is a hiccup, but it isn't something that can't be overcome. Even if the Sky's family is on the side of the Ascension Empire now, that's just one more enemy, there's little to worry about. Richard nodded. Obviously, Guerrero's had come to the same conclusion he had. I've already acted, Richard said. I've sent an elite group to conquer the Rain Galaxy. We can't allow any more variables to appear. And, since we've been exposed, there's no need to use such a weak family as a middleman any longer. We're already out in the open, so there's already nothing to hide. We will press forward in a domineering manner. Agreed, Guerrero said with a nod, not showing any dissatisfaction toward Richard's ask. Good. Good. The two hung up and fell into silence in their own respective corners of the universe. After hanging up, however, Guerrero's own expression became somewhat malevolent before he called in his own attendant. Tell the ones in the Rain Galaxy to retreat and hide themselves properly. Wait for my orders before taking any action. Yes, Patriarch, as the saying went, the best schemes were ones one could see but could only fall right into, and the best lies were laced with truth. What Alec, Richard and Guerrero's didn't know was that as they believed themselves to be cleverly navigating Lionel's web, they were only being further entangled. Chapter 1821. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:38 and 5 seconds AM Chapter 1821. Cloud. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Shouldn't we be going to the other locations now? Hephaestus suddenly asked. In truth, Hephaestus was a bit anxious. The pills Lionel had given him were burning a hole in his spatial device, and he was trying his best not to be impatient and wait for this to calm down before he consumed them. But seeing Lionel be so nonchalant about it, even leisurely reclining and staring into the depths of space as though he was in his own dream world, left him unable to remain quiet. Lionel, who had indeed been in his own world, looked up. Hephaestus nearly fainted. He had thought that Lionel might be thinking about something important, so he had felt slightly bad for interrupting, especially considering his original reasoning, but seeing Lionel's somewhat dazed look, he didn't even know what to say. The Sky's family wasn't the only worry. We have other enemies to deal with quickly. Even if we dealt a blow to them, those people were just cannon fodder. Most of them weren't even strong enough to control a galaxy to themselves. We can't get complacent now. Several gazes landed on Lionel when Hephaestus said this. In truth, he was correct, and the fact Hephaestus of all people was saying it spoke volumes. He was usually the meathead who let Raylion make all of his decisions for him. But right this moment, Raylion was as relaxed as Lionel, sitting in silence seemingly without any intention to say anything. Hephaestus knew Raylion too well. Considering that man's pride, even if he was feeling as anxious as he was to start absorbing the rewards Lionel had just given them, he wouldn't say anything about it. So Hephaestus knew that it was up to him to say something. Currently, the group was in a lounging area of the flagship. There was food and snacks around, and it didn't seem like a post-battle region at all. In fact, that battle had almost been too easy. They hardly had any casualties at all. Oh, that? Lionel said lightly. Don't worry about it. Hephaestus choked on air. What was that supposed to mean? Don't we have to deal with the Viola and chaotic water sectors? Them? They've been dealt with. We don't have to do anything for the next few weeks. Next time you hear information from them, they would have crippled themselves. Lionel yawned slightly, feeling a bit tired. Indeed, he had been doing too much running around lately and not enough resting. He faintly closed his eyes, seemingly about to take a nap. Hephaestus frowned. Lionel's words implied that they could do what they wanted for the next few weeks, but was this true? The members of the etching metal organization looked toward one another. They knew too little about Lionel, and even for those of them that did, it had been over 2 decades since they last saw him, so they were feeling that the situation was a bit odd too. However, before Hephaestus could follow up again, Raylion slowly stood to his feet and walked away. He was clearly taking Lionel's words to heart and was returning to his quarters. He had waited too long. It was about time he transcended his limits. Seeing this, Hephaestus understood. Ironically, of all those here, Raylion probably had the most respect for Lionel, despite the fact Raylion was so standoffish. If Lionel said the matter was handled, then it was handled. As for the others, like Lionel's brothers, and Aina and the girls, the former group didn't need to be told twice, and the latter followed Aina's cues, and she obviously took Lionel's words very seriously as well. Just like this, a supposed war ended after just a single half-body and a few dozen ambushes. As for the instigator, he reclined in a chair, his eyes closed and his breathing steady. He let the flagship drift through space as though nothing at all was happening. Within their rooms, Hephaestus and Raylion glared down at the pills they had been given, their heartbeats dancing at various rates. This meant a lot more for Raylion than it did for Hephaestus, or most others for that matter. Raylion had wanted to be number for as long as he could remember. He had an absolute obsession for power. It was what he cared about the most, at least in his youth. As he grew, he found other things he cared about, but that fire had still been there. It was just unfortunate that though he had once thought himself to be a great talent, to the wider dimensional verse, he was simply not worth very much at all. Staring at the pills, he could remember all the hardship he had gone through to make it to this level. He could have accepted Lionel's help all those decades ago, but his pride hadn't allowed him to. He refused to take handouts he hadn't earned. Now he had built up the best information in the whole of Earth's territory, and his hard work had grown the seed that would allow Lionel to crush so many enemies even while silently reclining in his chair. This was something he had earned, with his own 2 hands. This was the chance he had been waiting so many years for. Raelion opened the box with steady hands. He knew that just eating one of these might lead to his death, and all that hard work would have meant nothing. He sometimes thought about what it would mean to live a life of mediocrity, to be constantly protected by his own wife, to sit in the shadows and man an information network, but it simply wasn't in his being, it wasn't in his heart, it wasn't in his soul to be that man. The universe hadn't blessed him with great talent, but if it gave him another path to it, he swore that he would show it just what kind of mistake it had made snubbing him. Raelion reached forward and swallowed the first pill without hesitation. No more than half a breath passed before his body exploded into a cloud of flesh and blood. Chapter 1822. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:38 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 1822. Irony and Family Values. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The raid on the Rain Galaxy occurred almost immediately after Richard's orders were given out. Richard himself had no need to move out. A single elite team of the Viola family was more than enough. In just a single day, the Rain Galaxy was already unable to mount a counterattack, being forced back into the own territory further and further. The real shame of it was that they could have made this a real battle. But according to their deal with the Chaotic Water Sector, the Thrusting Skies Sector and the Viola family, the original intention was for them to pretend to be a third party caught in the conflict. They were meant to battle, but purposely lose. While they would suffer a few casualties, it wouldn't be anything that they couldn't recover from. But how could they guess that the Viola hadn't come here for a play? They had come here to conquer in earnest. By the time the Rain Galaxy realized that something was wrong with this picture and began to fight back in earnest, it was already too late. Just because a family controlled a galaxy, didn't mean that they had perfect control over all aspects of it. Normally, it meant that they had key bases in a majority of the quadrants at the very least, and could, as such, deploy troops anywhere within said region in a timely fashion. The Rain family met this criteria, but the Viola family countered it perfectly, not only taking advantage of the Rain family's surprise, but also by swiftly taking control of key regions and moving on just as swiftly. They killed a large majority of the powerful experts they came across, which was another reason the Rain family took so long to catch on to what was happening. In order to maintain secrecy and to make the hearts of the laymen go cold from being sacrificed, only the most elite of warriors knew the truth of what was happening, but with them dying, no one was reporting back the oddity of the situation. Only reports from lesser warriors were coming in, which were obviously ignored. Like this, the Rain family was beaten back to their main estate. The elders could only watch on with solemn expressions, regretting their decisions. If they had known that this would happen, how would they have ever agreed to trust the Viola? Even Earth hadn't made any attempts to conquer them yet, and now they practically fell to their knees in just a few days. Standing on warships high in the skies, the elites of the Viola family stood. Lexus Viola, Destiny Viola and Eddie Viola, 3 great talents of the pinnacle of the 6th dimension, all of whom had names that rang quite frequently in Earth's territory. But now, they had their blades pointed toward the Rain family. Just one of them was enough to strike fear in them, let alone all 3. What is the meaning of this? I thought we had a deal. Is this how the Viola family treats its allies? The current matriarch of the Rain family, Darla Rain, a middle-aged woman brimming with vitality, couldn't help but shout out, the weather replying to her fury with a thunderous rain. Unfortunately, the Viola family was entirely unmoved by this. Kill them all, Lexus said coldly. The Rain family paled as the warships descended. The heat of their engines and power of their winds raised the Rain estate to the ground before they even touched down. By the time they actually did so, millions had died. The sheer size of these warships was too much for Planet Rain to handle, but there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Rain family was eradicated with a great amount of grievances. In her final moment, Darla could only release a final plea for help. It wasn't the first time she had released this signal, but she had been ignored every time. Even in the end, as she breathed her last, a sword through her lung, that help never came. Lexus cleaned off his sword with a close, his purple eyes piercing and cold. We caught those outgoing signals, correct? Lexus asked. Yes, we did, Destiny replied, stretching out her curves with a lazy expression as though she couldn't be bothered to have participated in this battle. She didn't look like she had either, there wasn't a bead of sweat or blood in sight on her. What's the result? It seemed to have been a scatter shot. From what the technicians said, it was a web signal designed to be spread and only be gathered by those that have the appropriate decoding methods. Is there a way to decode those methods? We need to finish this to the end. Leaving enemies behind is a huge taboo, and if they're connected with a large power, well, the so-called no enemy left behind philosophy of the Viola family had ironically come due to Richard himself. He saw the kind of enemy that he had become due to Lionel's neglect, so he had grilled his family's juniors to never make the same mistakes. It was truly an irony of all ironies. There shouldn't be a problem. The decoding process will take a few days. A few days? Lexus turned serious. A few days was enough for information of what had happened here to leak and allow those who this message had been meant for to retreat. But more importantly than that, if it took their best days to decode these messages, then this was definitely a message delivery method far beyond the Rain family. It seems that their patriarch may have been correct about the Rain family's connection to larger powers. This was interesting and somewhat troubling at the same time. This could be a large deal or a small deal depending, but they would have to properly investigate it first. Only that way could they be prepared to deal with the rest. Their family had been wiped out once before, but their patriarch had allowed them to make a comeback. That humiliation was taught to every youth. They would never allow such a thing to happen again. Chapter 1823. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:38 a.m. Chapter 1823. Chaos. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1823 Chaos. The days passed by quickly and Lexus eventually got his answer. News? What's the report say? To the side, Eddie perked up as Destiny unfurled a document. They had all been somewhat anxious. If this had just been about the Rain family, it was no big deal. But it was clear to them that there were some large existences moving in the shadows, existences that they would definitely have to deal with to pave out the path for their future. Destiny quickly scanned the news and her gaze narrowed. According to this, there are literally dozens of locations. The team thought that they might be decoys to throw us off the scent. All of the locations seem to be very well hidden. Some are restaurants, some are convenience stations, there are also a few brothels and entertainment centers. It's hard to tell without an even more thorough investigation which of them are real and which aren't. This was troublesome. They had already wasted 3 days on this. If they wasted any more time, there would be nothing left to find. They had done an excellent job of suppressing the information until now, but it could only last for so long. No, we can't wait any longer. I'll contact the Patriarch, but get moving on my orders now. Build up enough teams to attack all of them at once. Also make sure that each team has at least a few elite 7th dimensional existences. We can't afford to send in a team that is too weak and potentially suffer a loss because of it. Well, go all out. Destiny and Eddie both nodded, agreeing with the sentiment. The operation began almost immediately. They had already prepared for this potential outcome, so the teams were already mostly formulated. All they were lacking were the 7th dimensional existences, and that approval would come from Richard himself. Until now, Richard had been hiding how many such powerhouses he had, but now he sat at a bit of a crossroads. When Lexus contacted him with the information, he took a moment to pause. The fact that these lines of communication existed at all seemed to confirm that the Rain family was, indeed, in cahoots with the chaotic water sector. But he had already informed the chaotic water sector days ago of their attacks, so if they were aware of this potential breach, they should have been ready to deal with it quickly. Due to this reason, Richard was less worried about the time aspect than Lexus and the others were because he knew the full scope of the story. But it was also precisely due to this that Richard had to okay the attack regardless. If he hesitated for some reason, he would alert the chaotic water sector to the issue at hand. Guerreros would definitely raise an eyebrow if he knew Richard had such information and chose not to act on it, and he might realize that Richard had some information about this matter. In order to keep the status quo, Richard had to attack. Only then could he keep Guerreros guessing about whether or not he was aware or not. But there was another reason as well. Richard needed to confirm whether or not Alec was speaking nonsense. There was a potential world where Guerreros had connections with the Rain Galaxy, but had no connection with the Cloud race. As Richard saw things now, it was still far more likely that Alec had betrayed them and was using Guerreros' potential secrets as leverage for himself. Richard had secrets. He hadn't been forthright with how many seventh-dimensional experts he had and many other things. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with them keeping secrets from one another, and a connection between the Rain and Chaotic Water Sector families was potentially benign. Richard maintained a level head. There was absolutely no reason to fall out with Guerreros over this matter. The way he saw it, things could go one of a few ways. First, they attacked and found nothing because Guerreros had smartly moved his things away already. This was what Richard most expected to happen. Second, they attacked and found some traces that led them to a different trail away from the Chaotic Water Sector. This was potentially likely to happen as well, though it might be troublesome for Guerreros to set something like that up in a small time. Third, and the smallest likelihood, he would attack and find that Alec hadn't been lying at all and there were some connections to the Cloud race indeed. Ultimately, Richard didn't expect to find anything substantial, although he would leave no stone unturned as he performed a nice play for Guerreros. As things stood now, Guerreros was far better as an ally than an enemy, even if he had some secrets. If he chose to backstab Richard in the future, well, Richard wasn't the young man of the past. His scheming nature had matured and his ability to see the chessboard was far clearer than most. He would be ready when that time came. For now, Guerreros, the Rain Galaxy, even Lionel and the Ascension Empire. They were all useful pawns. The operation proceeded and war broke out across the Ascension Empire. The Viola family swooped down like vipers, extending their claws and unleashing swift and decisive strikes. For across these dozens of locations, the Viola family found countless powerhouses, many of which wiped out large numbers of their elites before they were finally taken down. In the end, Richard's most likely outcome didn't come to fruition. Rather than finding nothing, they found all-out battle. Richard calmly accepted this outcome. It seemed that Guerreros had managed to set up the second option, even being willing to give up so many seventh-dimensional existences to succeed. Could it be that Guerreros' foundations were far deeper than he knew? Richard immediately commanded that the investigation begin. He wanted to see what backstories Guerreros had concocted for these men and women. What Richard didn't know was that across the universe, an old man with a balding head and furiously blowing mustache had shattered the windows to his office again. Cross Elder Avon stood completely furious. Ascension Empire. His roar billowed across the empire. Richard had no idea that the bases he had just destroyed weren't from the Chaotic Water Sector at all. Guerreros had long since commanded his men to retreat and hide. Those many stations he had destroyed, every single last one of them, was a hidden branch of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross stars, locations that Lionel had gotten by deciphering the force art hidden within the phone left behind in the convenience station. Small leaks even in a dam spanning countless kilometers could lead to floods. By now, the small leaks were too numerous to account for, because very soon, the straw that broke the camel's back was about to descend. Cross Elder Avon, there's something wrong. The reports we've received back don't tie back to the Ascension Empire at all. In fact, these signatures. Cross Elder Avon's rage calmed, his gaze becoming a piercing cold. Cloud race, he questioned. Chaos was about to break loose and the young man who caused it was reclining in his chair, still snoring away. Chapter 1824. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1824. Prepare if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1824. Prepare, Cloud race? How? Explain it to me. Quickly. Cross Elder Avon was becoming impatient, but at the same time, something felt fishy here. Why would the Cloud race attack them? The obvious answer was because Shield Cross Stars was interfering with Earth and this was messing with the Cloud Race's goal. But that was only a surface answer that didn't get to the deep roots of the matter. Only a low-level tactician would fall for such a thing. While it seemed harmful for the Cloud Race for the Shield Cross Stars to be so involved in Earth's matters, even if it was from the shadows, in reality, it was almost nothing but beneficial. So long as Shield Cross Stars existed in Earth's territory, it meant that humans would be butting heads, and so long as the humans were butting heads, it allowed the Cloud Race ample chances to take advantage and sow discord, making their plans flow even smoother. The less variables there were in Earth's territory, the more obvious any discord became, and the easier it was to pick out detractors. Like this, any movement that the Cloud Race made would have to be even more covert than usual, thus being contradictory to their original goals. If the Cloud Race had a halfway decent tactician leading their charge, which they most definitely did, they would not only not destroy Shield Cross Stars, they would ironically use them as their own shield, hiding behind them to reinforce their actions. The fact that things had happened in this way, and so boldly at that, made Cross Elder Avon believe that the Cloud Race was responsible even less. Unless that's why they were so bold in the first place? Avon narrowed his eyes before shaking his head. One could go around in circles like this all day until one ended up in a chicken and the egg scenario. Avon had too much experience to fall into something like that. 99% of the time, the simplest answer was the right answer. In that case, there would need to be evidence to have him judge otherwise. Yes, Elder. From the last bits of intel we gathered, the Ascension Empire thwarted a sneak attack planned. The attack was coordinated between the Thrusting Skies and Chaotic Water Sector, in addition to the Viola family of the Three Pillar Sector, Earth's main sector. How? Cross Elder Avon got to the crux of the matter. We have been receiving tips about a potential underground information network spreading through Earth, however we haven't been able to pin them down properly. It was our understanding that this network was crippled after the destruction of the Brazinger, Aderna, Critus, and Lavis families, but it is likely that they were able to survive and be repurposed by the Ascension Empire to be used in this fashion. The fact that Shield Cross Stars had some inkling about the etching metal organization wasn't impossible to accept, but if Lionel had been a fly on the wall, he would have realized where the leak came from. Treasurer Gemsey and the others, 4 of the 8 executives of the etching metal organization, had been exposed by Ray Lion as having formed ties with the 4 families. It was likely that in forming those ties, it caused a leak in integrity of the organization, thus leaving flaws for others to catch on to. There was a reason Ray Lion had wanted to maintain tight control over the organization. It was precisely to avoid situations like this one. This result was almost inevitable. However, it wasn't quite yet certain whether this was a good or a bad thing. Such an information network exists? Cross Elder Avon mumbled. We believe that the reason they've been able to remain so covert is because they're entirely focused on gathering information in Earth's territory. They've never encroached or poked at more powerful families or territories, so they've been very good at cleaning up their tracks and leaving nothing behind. Cross Elder Avon's gaze narrowed, seemingly thinking of something, but he still waved a hand and had his attendant continued. After the attack was thwarted, the Skies family was infuriated because they suffered the most losses and they seemed to have accused the Chaotic Water Sector of backstabbing them. The information in this space is muddled, but it seemed that the Viola family concluded that a change of tactics was needed and they swiftly conquered the Rain Galaxy before falling idle for a few days. It was only after that our stations were swiftly destroyed, leaving none alive. They were all attacked at once, and due to strict communication protocols, it was impossible to send back information. Cross Elder Avon shook his head. This was an inevitable part of covert operations. The various stations were connected to one another, but they didn't connect back to any Shield Cross Stars branches. This was to maintain plausible deniability and the works. However, there is an interesting piece of information here, the attendant suddenly said. Cross Elder Avon looked up. And what is that? Our technicians observed the final hours of the Rain family once again, and we found multiple attempts at communication. We had stationed one of our covert branches in the Rain Galaxy due to its strategic location, so they were paying close attention to the war while remaining out of the way. They intercepted those signals and reverse-engineered them. What was especially interesting about these signals was that they were targeted toward a relay station, and only then would said relay station send the signal out toward the appropriate location. The first signal was fine, but the second had very unique fluctuations only used by the cloud race. In addition, their destination was the chaotic water sector. The moment Cross Elder Avon heard this, he stood to his feet violently, the office floor beneath him almost giving out. Send out my order, now. I need 3 second-star rank fleets. You have 3 hours to prepare. Chapter 1825. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1825. Happened if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1825 happened to Cross Elder Avon. It suddenly all slipped into place. After the Sky's family was betrayed, they immediately concluded that someone must have betrayed them. How were they the only ones to suffer while the Viola and Chaotic Water sect had gotten off free? Something felt fishy to them. However, they had no evidence, so they could only roar out in displeasure and rescind their allyship. This was the best they could do. After this, the Viola family realized that it needed to change tactics and chose to conquer the Rain Galaxy swiftly. This was a galaxy right adjacent to the Milky Way. It was both not too close, and also not too far from the Ascension Empire. It was the perfect launching pad for war. Not knowing that the Chaotic Water sector had already placed its pawns in the Rain Galaxy, the Viola family attacked swiftly, eradicating them before they could react. At the same time, the Rain Galaxy probably allowed it to happen, thinking that it was part of the plan until it was way too late. In their panic, they sent out help signals, of which some were intercepted by the Viola family. There was trouble here, though. The Viola family had designed their signal-catching net to deal with technology of the human domain, but they had no idea how to counter and trap the force arts of the cloud race. Only Shield Cross Stars and the Void Palace were well informed enough about the technological advances of the other races that they could be confident in snagging all of these signals. Due to this mix-up, the Viola family foolishly believed that they had caught all of the signals, having no idea that they weren't dealing with humans, but were rather dealing with cloud race technicians. But this was where Shield Cross Stars shot itself in the foot. At the same time that the Viola family was gathering information, so too was Shield Cross Stars gathering information, using far more sophisticated methods. But as the Viola family was intercepting messages, it snagged some of Shield Cross Stars' signals. When the Viola family force artists were decoding these messages, they obviously had no ability to decode the cloud race force arts, so they instead ended up decoding the force arts of Shield Cross Stars instead. The network of Shield Cross Stars was well encrypted, but that was only in-house. All of the encryption was completed on the back end, but why would they be worried about encryption when they were in the process of intercepting the signals of others? In an irony of ironies, Shield Cross Stars had ended up opening itself up to a breach while trying to breach others, leading the locations the Viola family decoded not being the location of the Cloud race members like they should have, but instead the locations of the Shield Cross Stars stations. The Viola family thought that it was targeting the remnants of the Rain family, or more accurately, what remained of its lingering attachments to the Chaotic Water sector. They had wanted to maintain decorum with the sector, so they chose to attack anyway despite knowing that it was likely related to their people, and to their surprise, they actually found people, not realizing that they had never been attacking the Chaotic Water sector to begin with. It was a shit show, a complete shit show. However, even so, Cross Elder Avon was raring to go. Through this coincidence, they had actually weeded out such a large base of the cloud race. Under normal circumstances, Shield Cross Stars might choose to bide their time and wait, seeing if more of the cloud race would expose themselves. But the humiliation caused by the escape of Zulgella, Earth, and Windward had caused a huge blow to the prestige of Shield Cross Stars in the eyes of the people. Shield Cross Stars needed a big win, and they needed one now. In fact, Cross Elder Avon moved out personally, wanting to vent some frustration himself as well. Plus, this way, he could absolutely guarantee that there would be no more escapes. He was still entirely oblivious to the fingers pulling at his puppet strings from the shadows. K. In recent days, Guerreros had been feeling somewhat anxious. He had reacted to every situation perfectly, and yet things still felt like they were slowly getting out of his control. First, it was the failure of the sneak attack to begin with. He should be in the process of conquering the next half of Earth's territory after having already stormed through claiming the first 50% in just a single day, but that had failed. The second was the attack on the Rain Galaxy. Although he had nonchalantly allowed the Viola family to take it, he had been carefully rearing that peace for decades already. In fact, his intentions went so far back that he was even part of the first assault on Earth after it entered the fifth dimension. While he used the Rain family and those other galaxies as a cover, he had moved quite a number of pieces in the Milky Way to buy time for the penultimate moment. But the straw that almost broke the camel's back was the Viola family's swift attack on their branches. The Viola had attacked seemingly random places that Guerreros couldn't ran hick head Arnian WHV thu wald attack where he Alan Caldent act the Vinla famil vahanded hikans than at WNNLD make it a vin that he knew which Nlasek thu channeled of heen attacking instead. Although he had lost exactly 0 men to those attacks, they left him more uneasy than anything else had. It felt like a shadow was slowly wrapping around his neck and he had no idea what to do about it. The pressure had reached its peak today. His face was entirely drained of blood and he was even finding it difficult to maintain his human form. Sometimes, he found himself almost slipping back to his cloud figure. And then, it happened. Boom. 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 All across the chaotic water sector, the vicious sounds of battle erupted. Shield Cross Star moved with an unquenchable momentum, crushing everything in its path. Chapter 1826. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1826. Executive: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1826. Executive Guerreros fell to his knees, watching decades of hard work crumble before him. His face was entirely drained of blood and his heart was beating so fast he couldn't even feel it any longer. It felt as though everything was coming to an end. He wanted to roar out. Who was it? Who was it that did this? He felt like a scared man, roaring out into the darkness, wanting to know the face of the creature lurking in the shadows ready to pounce on him. He would rather see the ugly mug of a grotesque creature with a maw big enough to swallow his head whole than to be left in the sheer uncertainty of what might step out from the dark and into the light. However, there was no one coming to him with an answer on a silver platter. He didn't even try to fight back. Shield Cross Stars had actually sent one of those old monsters and he had lost all sense of propriety. He didn't seem to care about his status at all. He killed 5th dimensional experts just as easily as he killed 7th dimensional experts. The suppression of the chaotic water sector seemed to be nothing more than a joke to him. When that man approached, Guerreros finally couldn't control himself anymore and his human form crumbled. In his mind, he seemed to see the smirking image of a devilishly handsome young man. No matter how he tried, he couldn't erase that image from his head. No. It couldn't be him. That young man he said was only good at petty tricks couldn't possibly be the reason he was in this state now, the reason he had fallen to the point of not even being able to maintain his disguise, something even a toddler of his race could do. Cross Elder Avon descended from the skies with a bang. When he saw Guerreros, he was so pleasantly surprised that he roared into the skies with laughter. He had had the faint feeling that someone was leading him by the nose as well, but when he saw Guerreros, none of that seemed to matter anymore. Since there really was the cloud race in this place, he would take this as a win and nothing less. The cloud race was an odd-looking race indeed, at least by human domain standards. Their faces looked almost like a two-dimensional curved mask, the rest of the volume of their heads being made up by a foggy-like, gray energy reminiscent of clouds gathering on a soon-to-be rainy day. Their eyes were filled by murky white irises that looked like they fit better on the elderly than someone who was as young as Guerreros. As for the rest of their body, they looked quite human, just lankier and more gray than usual. What made Cross Elder Avon especially happy were the faint runes dancing within the cloud that made up most of the back volume of Guerreros' head. Those runes, much like the runes of the Rapax, represented a higher noble class of the cloud race. They had definitely caught themselves a good one this time. This was too excellent. Haha. I want to see who dares look down on my shield cross stars now. Avon's voice boomed. Who? Guerreros managed to mumble out these words. He had never suffered such a loss in his life. Ever since his youth, he had been nigh untouchable. He had even come here with all the confidence in the world to force the human race to his knees. And yet, just when he was that close, it all came crumbling down. Who did this to me? How did this happen? Who is responsible? Guerreros' words ended in a fiendish roar. Avon froze for a moment before he snorted. Did you not hear me say shield cross stars, brat? Listen well, you were apprehended by the protectors of humanity. Ha 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 ha. Guerreros laughed so hard that his cloud began to rain, sprinkling water falling down. Shield cross stars? You incompetent pieces of trash could never put me in such a state. Avon's expression became somewhat ugly before he chopped down with a hand against Guerreros' forehead and knocked him unconscious. He would be thoroughly interrogating this lad later, but for now, he didn't want to hear such nonsense. Apprehend the rest. Shield cross stars is invincible. Avon's voice roared and the other officers surged forward. Even as he said this, though, a hint of doubt crept up in the depths of his eyes. Who was it, indeed? *% moans echoed through the room. Lionel pressed Aina down beneath him, his strokes deep and slow as he savored her lips. While he quite enjoyed subduing this little vixen, he enjoyed these slower, more intimate moments as well. He could feel every inch of her body, hear every beat of her heart, complete an elegant dance between her tongue and his own. This didn't last long, though, as Lionel suddenly felt a hand grab his ass. He froze and pulled back, looking down at the pair of moist golden eyes that had a hint of mischievousness in them. Aina squeezed a couple times before pulling back and releasing a crisp slap. Why do you stop, cowboy? This mistress is not satisfied yet. Giddy up. Lionel was speechless for a long while. Is this what sexual assault feels like? He mumbled after a long while. Aina suddenly sputtered with laughter. What nonsense was this guy talking about while he was inside of her? You do it to me all the time, now you want to complain? Aina asked innocently as though she had been wronged. It's not the same. Lionel replied with great assurance. How is it not the same? Aina asked. Double standards, that's why. If you want to complain, take it to the board of directors. I'll warn you, though. I'm in all the executive positions. Aina blinked with a playful light in her eyes, grabbing Lionel's ass with both hands this time to thrust him deeper inside of her. I'd like to see what these executives can do then. You asked for it, Lionel's eyes flashed. Clearly, he hadn't taught this vixen enough of a lesson last time. Aina squealed, but it was already too late for regret. If Guerreros knew what the enemy of his lifetime was doing while his own life was being entirely ruined, it was hard to say how he'd react. Chapter 1827. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 1827, until. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1827 until. Aina laid on her side in the little spoon position, angling a hand back to rest her palm on Lionel's cheek and seemingly enjoying the kisses that trailed her neck and shoulder. The somewhat dazed look in her eye and the shaking of her legs painted a different sort of story, but unfortunately for her, Lionel had a firm grip on her one raised leg, leaving her no room to run away. At this point, Lionel was certain that she only provoked him like this despite knowing the ending only because she liked it so much. In the end, it hardly felt like he was in control at all, but he still chuckled, finally letting her leg go. The slight shift in position, albeit slow, hit her at a new angle and Aina shivered once more, apparently too tired to do much other than breathe hard. Her twitching caused Lionel to release his own breath, a torrent he had been holding back for a long while rushing forward. Lionel smiled with satisfaction, running a hand up and down Ana's thigh, before trailing up her toned belly and grabbing a nice and soft handful of breast. His hand seemed to have a mind of its own, finding its favorite position without any prompting from him. "Are you sure you don't have any work to do?" Ana's voice might as well have been a whisper. It seemed that she didn't have much strength to even speak at a normal volume. Lionel laughed. "What, are you trying to kick me out after you're done with me?" "Well, it is a little hot," Ana joked. "Who asked you to give off so much heat?" Lionel smiled and waved a hand. Suddenly, the two went from on their bed to within the cool waters of their personal bathhouse within the segmented cube. Almost instantly, the two felt refreshed and cleansed at the same time. "Ah." Ana hopped up a bit, feeling a strong pinch to her butt. She had just been sitting comfortably, but now she could only glare back toward Lionel, who was already laughing. "A small punishment for doubting me. Don't you know how amazing your husband is?" Ana snorted before settling the back of her head onto Lionel's cheek again. "I still don't see a wedding ring. Plus, it's been almost a month now since we've left this place. I'm a bit worried about Earth and what retaliation it might face." Lionel laughed again. "Those guys are too busy scrambling not to lose their lives to attack Earth." "Really?" Ana asked. Back then, when Hephaestus was flustered and questioning Lionel, Ana could only roll her eyes. This man loved her almost more than anyone else in his life, and yet even for her it felt like pulling teeth to get him to explain anything. Compared to her, Hephaestus was even more out of luck. The others could just cross their fingers and hope that Lionel was competent. Lionel's teammates were already used to this. Lionel went off and did things on his own all too often. Sometimes he would even manipulate them without them being aware of doing exactly what he wanted them to do. When most thought about it, it made little sense. The effort needed to manipulate your enemy and your allies at the same time should have been more than the effort needed just to manipulate the former, but for some reason Lionel almost always insisted on taking the more difficult route. If it wasn't for the fact Lionel had grown up with his brothers since they were toddlers, ever since they were all given their assignment after the gene assessment exam, many might have already felt dissatisfied to the point of never interacting with him again. However, Lionel's teammates saw things differently. The thing was, if Lionel wanted to manipulate a person and have them never find out, it was as easy as breathing. Even to this point, the Viola and Guerreros still had no idea who had put them in such a situation. If Lionel manipulated you, and you knew about it, it was more than 99% likely that he gave you enough information to know about it, and in his own weird way, that meant he liked you and respected you. That day during the championship game all those years ago, when James tried to throw the game for reasons Lionel had still yet to care enough to find out about, was a prime example. James thought he had succeeded in throwing the game, only for Lionel to manage to turn it around anyway. In fact, by that point, Lionel was already over 90% certain of James' intention, and yet he still threw him the ball on purpose. This was all to say that at this point, Ana felt that Lionel was a lost cause, but her curiosity had gotten the best of her this time around. Although the etching metal organization likely had the information she needed, if she went to ask, wouldn't that be like admitting Lionel didn't explain anything to her either? Her gaze suddenly flashed. She really had to rein in this unruly boy some more. "Really?" Lionel laughed. "Would I lie to you? Maybe, maybe not. But what you would definitely do is annoyingly hold back information." Ana slapped Lionel's hands away from her chest. "Tell me, what happened?" "Well, I didn't really do much. They just shot themselves in the foot." "Who asked them to be so stupid?" Ana's lips twitched. She had been by Lionel's side all this time, so she knew that he hadn't taken a step out, nor had he asked anyone for information about what had happened, but he was still so confidently calling those patriarchs who ruled over trillions of people stupid. "They're fighting each other?" "Well, a little bit. But Shield Cross Stars is ironically a nice sword to use. There'll probably be news of the chaotic water sector being annihilated soon." "Annihilated?" Ana's brows raised. "Why's that? And by Shield Cross Stars? How'd you manage that?" "Well, they are members of the Cloud race, so shield cross stars was probably just finally doing its job. Aina blinked. Since when had the chaotic water sector become members of the cloud race? Lionel chuckled. Remember when they somehow found us in the middle of nowhere and ruined our honeymoon? I've known since then. The human domain didn't have the capability to do that with the precautions I had taken. Also, trying to bait me into killing their prince with a weapon of shield cross stars was really weird, and I couldn't understand why they were so insistent, until... Aina was very curious about where Lionel was going with this until she felt a pair of hands creeping back toward her chest. Aina smiled and shook her head. It was almost like he was taking them as a reward. She would never understand why men were so obsessed with these things. As far as she was concerned, she would prefer her hair to be cut to ear length and her breasts to be about a quarter as large. If those two things happened, her combat prowess would probably rise by another 10%. But so long as Lionel was happy, she would let it slide. Lionel smiled triumphantly as he continued his story. Chapter 1828. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 1828. Blame yourself if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1828. Blame yourself. Well, there are a few possibilities. I thought about the potential fail-safes the flagship could have. There could be a sudden activation when a human was killed with its abilities. After all, shield cross stars would have a vested interest in making sure their officers weren't corrupt, and an even larger interest in making sure that if their flagships ever ended up in enemy hands, it wouldn't be able to turn against them. Of course, that ability's scope and range would have to be limited, or else there would be too many checks and balances stopping the shield cross stars officers from doing their duty. So, the number of humans that could gain such protections would likely be limited to the nobility, which is why he would have to send his son. So it seemed that their patriarch was goading me into attacking and killing his son and his protectors so that the flagship would shut down and become unusable. At the same time, he would gain the favor and reward that came with not only the return of such a valuable military asset, but also my capture as well. It was a smart plan, and the perfect cover. That idiot Richard was the perfect fall guy too. He was useless for everything other than the blood running through his veins. But then I thought of another possibility. The logistics of sacrificing a useless prince for the favor of shield cross stars made perfect sense on the surface, but there were a lot of problems with it. Setting aside the fact that killing your own prince would cause a blow to the prestige of your empire, recapturing the flagship didn't come with any guaranteed benefits either. There was a bounty on my head, but that bounty is chump change in the face of a family on that scale. At the same time, there was no particular bounty for the flagship, so the chaotic water sector was basically essentially just hoping that they would likely get a reward for their service. Doesn't it seem a bit stupid for a patriarch to take such a risk with no real tangible reward? While Lionel's bounty was plentiful to an individual, to a large-scale family or organization, it was practically pennies. What was a mere 10,000 kilograms of seventh dimension or to people who worked on that scale? That might be enough to run a single high-class city for a few years, but a single family might have hundreds of those cities under their control. This was done on purpose by shield cross stars. They preferred small teams, vigilantes, and bounty hunters to chase down criminals. This was so that any prestige that came from capturing such criminals could only be enjoyed on an individual basis. One could imagine the kind of issues shield cross stars might run into if a large organization or family became famous for catching many hard-to-snag criminals. At that point, why should shield cross stars exist? They might as well be replaced by said family or organization instead. Aina nodded faintly to Lionel's words, seemingly seeing a bit of a picture forming. But the logical leaps that remained still seemed too far apart. But then I thought of something else. I learned about the cloud race in the Void Library. They're an interesting race of people indeed. Their brains are amorphous and actually take the shape of real clouds. They're incredibly intelligent as a result because their memories, thoughts, and synapses aren't tied down to a physical form or even a tangible limit. That aside, the cloud race has tiers of nobility a lot like the Rapax, and those tiers manifest in runes that float within their cloud figure, or in other words, their brain. The more concentrated and dense the runes, the higher class they are and the more talented. These runes, however, have one path that they follow, and that's the path of deception and mimicry. The reason the brain capacity of a cloud race member has to be so large is because when they become someone else or pretend to be someone else, they're taking into account thousands, millions, billions, or even trillions of variables all at once depending on their talent and strength. The details don't really matter, but what's important is that when it comes to scanning, understanding, organizing, compartmentalizing, and then spitting out a summary, the cloud race is practically untouchable in this regard. And then I thought about that Captain Vimward fellow who turned out to be a cloud race member, and Captain Earth and Zulgella as well. All three of them had taken the risk to become high-class officers of S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Stars. You have to wonder why. When I thought to that point, I suddenly thought of something else. What if the entire point was to get the ship to shut down so that they could scan how it worked and reverse-engineered it? What if in the middle of a war, all of human domain's greatest weapons just stopped working because it recognized the death of a cloud figure as a human instead? Aina's eyes widened as she sat up slightly. If what Lionel was saying was correct, didn't that mean he had just saved the human domain from a calamity it didn't even know was coming? Wait, who was to say that he had stopped it? What if there were others of the cloud race on the same mission that had had far more success? Aina calmed down and her gaze narrowed. Wasn't that all just speculation, though? You could have been wrong. Lionel laughed. Like I told you at the beginning, the moment they found us, I knew they were members of the cloud race. I only became doubly sure after Vimward, Earth, and Zulgella escaped. In my exchange with Vimward, he used a very special movement technique that exposed his race, but he didn't have to do that. In fact, I'm pretty sure he exposed himself on purpose. Why would he do that? Because the cloud race only really has one obvious weakness, Lionel said. And that weakness is that they can't scan a new target unless they release their cloud figure. Aina's head snapped around and looked toward Lionel, who was smiling. You mean? Yeah. The reason they were able to lock onto me and find us in the middle of nowhere is because Vimward likely has a near-perfect replica of me in his cloud figure, a replica he likely passed on to the patriarch of the chaotic water sector who then used it to hatch this scheme. Then that means... Lionel nodded, but a cold and domineering light danced within his irises. Since they failed the first time, and even suffered such a severe loss, next time they come, they'll bring a lot more firepower, and that firepower might not just mean weaponry. Since they failed the first TID for such 1 ton time they'll bring a lot fire PD that fire PI not just pawnry. Aina blinked, the undisguised indifference and confidence in Lionel's eyes making her feel somewhat hot again. Lionel felt something grab him below and he blinked out of his thoughts, looking toward Alna somewhat speechlessly. Hadn't she just barely been able to speak before? What was with this quick recovery? Don't give me that look, you only have yourself to blame, Aina smiled a toothy smile. Now come please your mistress. Chapter 1829. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 1829. Casual breakthrough. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1829 Casual breakthrough. Lionel felt very lucky that he had invested so heavily into his vitality. If not for this, there was a chance that he really might not be able to keep up with Aina at all. Luckily, he went from potentially suffering loss after loss, to being quite undefeatable. Though, considering Aina's own talents, her recovery was off the charts and almost any little thing he did seemed to trigger her. As far as Lionel was concerned, though, these were good problems to have. If there was anyone in his life that he wanted to please, this future wife of his was near the top of a very, very short list. About a day or so later, Lionel sat in a state of meditation. It was very easy to become complacent without the pressure of the Void Palace constantly barraging him from all sides. If there were any problems with the fact he had been booted prematurely, it was this. He understood his own personality quite well. There was a subtle sort of lazy undertone to everything he did that came from a place of complacency, a place that made it feel like he was constantly looking down on the whole world. But Lionel also knew better than anyone else that he hadn't earned such a complacency yet. Unless he actively suppressed it, he could spend weeks or even months at a time rolling around in bed with Aina without even the slightest worry in the world. Luckily, he had become hyper-aware of this flaw of his for multiple reasons. First, there was Aina by his side. No matter what, she didn't have such complacency. Although she hadn't said anything after learning about Lionel's destruction of the Brazinger family, Lionel knew quite well that this was because they had entered a sort of second honeymoon period of their relationship. Aina probably still felt like what they had was fragile and she wanted to protect it, so rather than complaining about something she likely had a great right to complain about, she suppressed those feelings and directly ignored them. However, it was clear by how much harder she was working every day that it bothered her. Lionel wasn't clueless. In fact, he was hyper-aware of everything around him, and this hyper-awareness only became sharper after he unbound his soul and unleashed his true king's might lineage factor. He understood the ins and outs of Aina's thoughts, maybe more than even she herself did. Back then, while it was true that Aina had been fatigued from helping him bring his body back to 100%, her hatred of the Brazinger family was deep enough that this wouldn't have mattered to her. Logic and emotion were two different things, but one wasn't necessarily more important than the other to most people not named Lionel Morales. The second reason was because of his king's might and the evolution of his dream force which had allowed him to enter Tier 3. Lionel's increase to his dream force allowed him to be hyper-aware of his own thoughts and the process by which they formed. He had a deeper understanding of why he was the way he was and what reasons there might be at the root of it all. Ultimately, he knew that if he didn't force himself to work, or external pressure didn't force him, he could easily become complacent. So rather than allowing himself to dictate things, he set a dream counter ability to trigger instead. And now, thanks to that, he was currently in blissful meditation. His mind compared and contrasted the improvements he had made in dream force versus the lack of improvement in everything else. He then referenced this with the shifts to his emulation spatial force and slowly noted down several comprehensions. Thela had made a great deal of improvement back when she was still in possession of this innate node. As such, there were many runes already formed. The formation of her runes were actually much weaker than the formation Lionel had made on his two Scarlet Star Force innate nodes. However, Lionel didn't feel like he could take much credit for this at all considering the circumstances that had led to things being this way in the first place. But what he did realize was that there were subtle shifts in her innate node that weren't in his own. Some parts of the rune were far thicker and denser than other parts that looked to be drawn lighter and more illusory. These seemed to represent parts that she was more familiar with versus parts she had less comprehension about. This was intriguing to Lionel because he had never formed this way. Even for his dream force or his vital star force, they either formed, or didn't, there was no in-between like this. The question was if the reason was due to his approach, or if it was just a matter of mindset. Lionel did seem like the type of person to not be satisfied with moving on unless he comprehended something entirely. Only then would he use it. This was how things had always been with his weapon forces. This time, however, Lionel didn't feel like he was to blame. There was something deeper going on here. If I'm correct, it's a matter of whether this world can sustain it or not. I have a feeling that if I was in an 8th-dimensional world, forming partial runes like this would be very much possible. In lesser worlds, though, without a perfect comprehension, runes can't form at all. Essentially, the reason why Thela could form partial runes and increase her force manipulation in this way was because her environment could help her to do so. That hypothesis should have about a 97.2% chance of being correct, give or take. Lionel calmly nodded and moved on in his deductions, seemingly not realizing just how groundbreaking this discovery was. If one had an all-or-nothing approach to force manipulation, moving forward would be impossible with sudden enlightenment, like what Lionel had experienced a few weeks ago, or without a reference, like the complete innate node in Lionel's kidney. This would be an inherent weakness of imperfect worlds, or in other words, worlds beneath the 9th dimension. What was even more groundbreaking, though, was the fact that Lionel felt that he could create a workaround based on this. And if he was correct, force manipulation improvement would come as natural to his people as it did for the geniuses of that zone. Chapter 1830. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 47 seconds AM Chapter 1830. One condition: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1831 condition. Lionel felt that his deductions simply ran smoother now with the improvement to his dream force. He saw the world with more clarity and could simulate with much greater speed and accuracy. It was as though he had his own personal vast world in his mind, just waiting to be experimented on. He made large leaps with every passing second, and in just a few hours, he had created dozens of potential prototypes for a treasure that could help with this. His favorite iteration was the simplest configuration, relying only on pure force crystals, the mantras he retrieved from the zone, and a life force type jade. The only bottleneck would be Anastasia and her progress in dissecting and deducing the mantras. But outside of that, the gadget was so simple that Lionel could allow the segmented cube to mass-produce them once the blueprint was set. Of course, the result wouldn't be as perfect as a true ninth-dimensional world would be, but it didn't need to be. Even Lionel was much too far away from needing a ninth-dimensional structure to help him along, let alone his brothers and the others. There was something curious about these deductions, though. Logically, even without a ninth-dimensional world, lower-level worlds should at least be able to sustain partial comprehensions on equally as low-leveled runes. But for some reason they could not. There was a deeper sort of imperfection here. But for some reason, even the current Lionel couldn't grasp what it was. Lionel opened his eyes and exhaled. That was enough for now. Anastasia could handle the rest. By the time he was finished with the other things he had to do, the first would be finished and he should be able to use it immediately with his vital star force. Like that, his speed of comprehension should skyrocket immediately. It's been 3 weeks, Lionel thought with a cold flash in his eyes. He had given the oryx enough time. Now the two choices before them were all too obvious. Lionel could feel that his tribulation was coming and he didn't know how long he would vanish for. He had to be certain that everything was perfectly lined up before he left because there was no telling what variables might appear in his absence. So, he was entirely serious about eradicating the oryx if they didn't comply. He would do everything he could to leave Earth in an absolute state of peace before he vanished. But first, he would pay a little visit to the thrusting skies sector. He gave Aina, who was meditating not far from him, a kiss on the forehead before he left the segmented cube and manned the flagship to soar across Earth's territory. *K. Alec had been sitting on pins and needles for the last several weeks. While the sectors were in chaos and everyone was ducking, hoping to not be the next ones to be destroyed and wondering how all of this was happening, he was all too clear who was responsible. The young man never raised a single finger. He fought just a single battle and casually strode away after he was done. Right now, he was probably reclining with a woman in his arms, watching the world collapse around him. The thrusting skies sector had taken a small blow after losing so many sixth-dimensional experts, but the Viola family lost several elite seventh-dimensional experts in their sudden ambush attempt and my more promising sixth-dimensional experts. Even setting aside this, the chaotic water sector got it the worst because not a single aspect of their empire remained. They were wiped out by shield cross stars in just a single day. Seeing these things happen one after another, Alec couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he even found it difficult for him to breathe properly from day to day. He was tired of people asking him what was wrong, so he just sent away all of his attendants and he sat completely alone in a dining room capable of seating and serving over 300 people at once, and yet he didn't touch any of the food before him at all. Suddenly, Alex stood violently to his feet, snapping his own head around with such force that he quite nearly almost ended his own life. When he saw the young man casually seated on the host's chair behind him, a table placed in an elevated position like the medieval dining rooms of old, his face paled completely. He seemed to have entirely forgotten that Lionel was a mere, sixth-dimensional existence and that he should have no need to fear him in a one-on-one battle. Lionel smiled lightly and didn't say anything immediately, only faintly greeting Alec. But to his surprise, the patriarch immediately fell to his knees and slammed his forehead against the ground with such force that the entire room trembled. "I am willing to place the entire strength of the Skies family behind you, Imperial Prince. Whether that be for the coming air wars or anything else you might need us to do. I swear I will do my utmost. I only ask for a path to survival." Lionel blinked a few times. Was he really that scary? He hadn't really been all that cruel in his estimation. He could have made things far worse for the three parties, but in the end he decided to just eradicate the chaotic water sector. As far as he saw it, he had actually been quite nice. Seeing that Lionel didn't answer, Alec didn't dare to look up. He was absolutely subservient to Lionel, his heart having been subdued entirely. Truthfully, this was the best outcome for Lionel. The thrusting skies sector was about as powerful as the chaotic water sector, or at the very least, the chaotic water sector's display to the outside world. They were a seventh-dimensional sector not quite as good as the constellation families, but not too far away either. Essentially, they were around the upper portions of the middle of the pack when it came to the seventh dimension. They would probably immediately become Lionel's strongest support in terms of raw power. In past years, seventh-dimensional existences couldn't participate in the air wars, but this was obviously thrown out the window considering the heirs themselves were in the seventh dimension now. Once Lionel entered the seventh dimension as well, the heirs' wars would begin and there would be no escaping such things. Lionel nodded to himself. By the time he entered the seventh dimension, the use of the Umbra, Florer, Midas and Radix families would probably be far more useful to him, but regardless, the Skies family would be a decent smokescreen. Plus, they would be a good sword to use in taking down the Viola family for good. Alright, I accept, Lionel said lightly. Before Alec could be overjoyed, though, Lionel spoke again. On one condition. Open up everything to me. I want to know even the deepest held secrets of your family. If you choose to hide anything from me, I will leave and not look back. When we meet again, it'll be during the destruction of your sector. Chapter 1831. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1831. Everything if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1831. Everything with Alec's current mental state, he crumbled without much effort on Lionel's part. He didn't even consult the various elders of his family, he simply used his authority as patriarch to directly force them in line. When Lionel saw this, he didn't say anything, but he made a mental note of it. From his analysis, Alec's prestige in the family was high enough to get away with this, but unless there was a change, there would likely be a straw that broke the camel's back later on down the line. The common people could be forced in line like this because they didn't understand what was going on anyway, but the rich, powerful and affluent couldn't be, at least not without tangible evidence and reason for what they were doing. Only Alec was aware of Lionel's fearsomeness, so it made sense for him to bow his head. But while the others trusted Alec, if his choice didn't bear fruit, then the inevitable result was for them to lose respect for Alec as opposed to suddenly coming to trust Lionel. If Alec realized this or not, he didn't seem to acknowledge one way or another. Instead, he did as Lionel demanded and revealed everything about his family, everything from census information, to their relationship with surrounding sectors, even down to how many young geniuses they had sent to the Void Palace. In truth, Lionel didn't need any of this information. The Etching Metal organization already had such detailed analysis on every organization, family, and business within Earth's borders. However, by cross-referencing them, Lionel was able to tell how truthful Alec was or not. And in the end, there were even a few reveals that even the Etching Metal organization hadn't been aware of. For one, the Thrusting Skies organization had been contacted by the Cloud Race for cooperation. Alec and their family elders hadn't agreed or disagreed, maintaining a neutral sort of stance. This told Lionel something very important. The Cloud Race had methods of contacting various families that were nigh undetectable. In fact, they were so precise that they could even weed out potential spies from other families ahead of time so that such information would never leak. And that was the second thing Lionel learned. Many of the Skies family's spies had suddenly been weeded out one day, with even a few agents of the Etching Metal organization suffering. If Lionel was correct, this was likely related to the mind-reading abilities of the Cloud Race. How could they perfectly replicate another's identity if they weren't also able to go through and replicate all of their memories? The Cloud Race was likely using this method to gain the trust of many families all while implanting their own spies. Lionel didn't believe that there weren't any members of the cloud race that had remained behind, and as expected, Lionel did find one among the elders, one that was very much against Alec's sudden change. The change caught Alec and the elders off guard, but the battle was equally as abrupt and short. Surrounded from all sides, there was simply nothing the cloud race individual could do. In the end, Lionel ended up taking their corpse into a snow globe. He had learned quite a bit about the cloud race through the Void Library, but there was little that could compare to having the real thing in his possession. The last thing of interest that Lionel learned that wasn't part of the Etching Metal Organization's information was actually related to the chaotic water sector. This time, it wasn't due to the organization's missing it, but rather because that sector wasn't within their jurisdiction. As such, they only had some miscellaneous information about it. According to Alec, the cloud race was targeting very key sectors that contain natural resources of note. At first, Lionel was a bit confused by this. The chaotic water sector, at least before the cloud race arrived, was about as powerful as the thrusting skies sector. Both were semi-impressive, but nothing to write home about in the grand scheme. There were dozens of sectors on their level. So why them? The obvious answer was that it was much harder to infiltrate the stronger families, and this was what Lionel had always assumed, until Alec turned his perspective on his head. The chaotic water name, and thrusting skies for that matter, all came about for a reason. The chaotic water sector was known not only for its exceptionally dense water force, but namely a very unique galaxy known as the Chaotic Water Galaxy, where this thickness reached its apex. In that place, water force was so high in concentration that it suppressed all other things, even to the point that all colors were tinged with a slight hint of blackish blue. The closer you got to the center of this galaxy, the more exaggerated the effects, until you finally did make it to the center and walking through the air felt like wading through water. The thrusting skies sector had a very special galaxy much like this, but instead for lightning. That was when it clicked for Lionel. The point of this wasn't the resources, at least not in their current state. Rather, the cloud race was interested in monopolizing these resources after Earth's evolution influenced them to evolve themselves. If Lionel was correct, if the Skies family allowed their world spirit to be assimilated by his mother's world spirit and allowed their heritage to fade, the evolution of their galaxy would skyrocket, and very soon, the resources on hand would become almost too many to spend even in several lifetimes. In a place of such high force concentration of a single kind, just the sheer amount of force and pure force crystals would be mind-boggling, let alone the other natural treasures that might appear. When Lionel got to this point in his thought process, he looked toward Alec. He didn't know why he hadn't thought of it before. If he wanted to assure the loyalty of these families, this was the obvious way to do it. Lionel grinned. This changed everything. Chapter 1832. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 1832. Morning. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1832 morning. These families were all fighting back so hard against Earth, not realizing that this was doing nothing other than hindering their own progress. Alec hesitated for the first time in a long while. Assimilating with Earth wasn't just about power, but they felt like they were losing a part of themselves in doing so. Although their world spirit would eventually give way no matter what they did, unless they could somehow conquer Earth, it still felt off, almost like they were abandoning their ancestors. Lionel chuckled a bit inwardly, not pressing Alec very hard. In truth, the patriarch had already exceeded his expectations in this regard. The man was much smarter than he had originally given him credit for. Ultimately, this was a problem of the human domain, not just Earth. Humans weren't a cohesive whole, nor did they follow the same strict sort of hierarchy standards and paths that other races did. This was both their strength and their greatest weakness. To a Rapax, being assimilated by another Rapax family might feel bad, but they were ultimately the same people, with the same heritage, and the same culture and thoughts. More importantly, they also all followed the same paths. In the human race, there were no obvious markers of nobility and peasant, or the greater-thans and lesser-thans. This caused those at the bottom of the rung to have a chance to climb up so long as they put in enough effort and got lucky enough, but it was also the reason why, even with such obvious benefits right before them, these families were reluctant to take the obvious choice. Alec took a breath and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they had some resolution in them. You say that if we assimilate, our evolutionary potential will rise? Immediately. Lionel said without hesitation. Your children, as of this generation, will begin to be people of Earth. My grandfather also has a method of shortening the 5-generation period and allowing your talents to catch up almost immediately, however this will require loyalty and contributions on your part. Even so, without these contributions, you'll be able to directly take part in the evolution of your resources. Your weaker territories will quickly catch up, and your main resource, the thrusting skies galaxy, will become 100-fold more valuable. Alec nodded slowly and pressed a hand to his chest. He took a deep breath and his eyes watered. Lionel's gaze sharpened when he saw this. He could feel Alec's emotion, he was clearly distraught by this decision. Lionel felt that he was wrong about something for the very first time in a very long while. Is this normal? Am I too heartless on this topic? Or is there something else going on? Lionel's gaze shifted toward the elders of the Skies family and they all looked equally as distraught. Many of them even had to be held back by others, but there was clear murderous intention in their eyes while they were looking at Lionel. Lionel hadn't been alive to experience a divided Earth. The only Earth he knew was a single united nation under the Ascension Empire. Skin tone, race, culture, it had never mattered, so Lionel never really thought about it either. This was the first time Lionel was seeing such a visceral reaction related to one's pride in their country and their fellow man. Back on ancient Earth, there were probably any number of smaller nations that may have led better lives by obediently handing the reins over to a large nation, but how many of them chose to do that? How many wanted to do that? Alec was willing to open up his family and show Lionel their everything, but when it came to this decision, one that Lionel felt was a no-brainer, he felt deeply hurt and troubled. Lionel's sharp gaze softened and his oppressive air cooled somewhat. Still, somewhere deep inside, he felt like there was something he had missed. I remember back when I cleared my first zone and met Uncle Montez, he had said that as one of the first 4 to succeed, I should have received a quarter of the world's spirit with a chance to fuse them into one in the future. However, it had already chosen its owner long ago, so I lost that chance forever. It chose. It chose. Could the world spirit be sentient? If that was true, then wouldn't the world spirit have all the same instincts as any other living being? An instinct to survive? An instinct to evolve? And if that was the case, what would be the best way to do that? Wouldn't it be to stoke an undying devotion in the people it served? Lionel felt a slight hint of guilt within. Even he found it difficult to just dismiss these very real emotions that Alec and the others were feeling as the mere manipulations of a semi-sentient spirit. However, at the same time, he had to acknowledge it as part of the equation. The troubling part was that, in practice, the truth didn't matter. No matter what had caused it, the fact was that most people would feel this level of devotion toward their world spirit. The more powerful the world spirit, the more powerful these feelings would likely be. Unless he could find the right combination of circumstances, getting people to give up their world spirits willingly might be an almost impossible task, and Lionel wasn't sure if taking it by force was possible. While he could kill the wielder, the world spirit didn't have to follow him, and given what Lionel knew about them, he wouldn't be able to catch it either. Only if he was a member of the world spirit's world would it follow him so simply. Alec pulled his hand away from his chest and raised it into the air. A mournful cry spread across the thrusting skies sector and the entire region shook. Within the Ascension Empire, Emperor Fox looked up with an unreadable expression before he suddenly chuckled. Interesting. Chapter 1833. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 1833, Young man, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1833 Young man, representations of Lionel's light half of the Northern Star lineage factor on my Instagram, smiley face at ___. Lionel left the Skies family in a semi-foul mood. The morning of the Skies people left him with a sour taste in his mouth that he had expected. He seemed to be feeling something beyond him, but it wouldn't be until years from now that Lionel understood where this bitterness was coming from, much the same way it would be a long while before he understood where his love of Aina came from. In this very same foul mood, Lionel crossed the universe and appeared above the Oryx's territory. The race of people were quite secluded. They lived on just a single planet in a barren solar system, completely out of the way of others. Due to the circumstances, it was almost too easy for them to spot Lionel's arrival. Maybe it was due to his mood, but Lionel even somewhat hoped that the Oryx would resist. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately in most respects, that didn't come to be. Elther's words to his father seemed to have struck a chord. This time, when Lionel stood before the Oryx King, the latter had a hint of respect in his eyes that had never been there before. Even now, the Oryx King couldn't fathom how Lionel had ignored such temptation, but if there was a chance to be taken, it made sense for him to take it on Lionel. The Oryx King didn't expect the conditions to be as smooth sailing as they were in the past. He could understand this concept quite well. However, when Lionel finished laying out his conditions, he still couldn't help but sigh. Most of them were fine, but the final one left the most bitter taste in his mouth. Lionel wanted them all to move to Earth and become official citizens. Once they did that, he would allow bygones to remain bygones. With that move, much of the comfort and calm lives the Oryx had been granted would be over. King Oryx really only had himself to blame for all of this. Lionel had wanted to treat them well and as one of his own, but what he received in return wasn't the mutual respect he had been expecting. Instead, he found rudeness, indifference, and although it was subtle, mockery. The various Oryx elders were not happy with Lionel's demands at all, but the Oryx King simply raised a hand to stop them all. I will accept your demands so long as my people can have a large city of our own. You can have the entire moon, Lionel said casually. He had recently raised the moon and all of its structures to the ground, but much like the recovery of a seventh-dimensional individual couldn't possibly compare to a third-dimensional one, so too was the case for seventh-dimensional worlds. By now, the moon had already recovered and was once again filled with lush forests and rushing waters. The only unfortunate part was that its wildlife had suffered a blow, though the most powerful of the land and sea creatures were most definitely still alive. Then I'll thank you in advance, King Oryx said with a slight hint of relief in his tone. This was better than what he had expected, and he had a feeling that Lionel had done things like this on purpose. You all can have half a month to prepare and move out. I will prepare everything in the meantime. The meeting was just as short as the one he had had with the Sky's family. At a certain point, when you held enough strength in your hands, things became much easier. In the past, getting people to follow him was like pulling teeth. But now, Lionel had a solid base for himself, one that made him more than confident in facing and dealing with the world. %% as Lionel was beginning to feel much better and even quite confident, his number of enemies still seemed to be multiplying. This only seemed to be more of the case after Lionel began to assimilate one region after another, displaying efficiency the Ascension Empire had never displayed before and putting smiles on the faces of the ministers of Earth. In just a week, not only had Lionel assimilated the whole of the Thrusting Skies sector, but within the Three Pillars sector, over 60% of the galaxies had had their world spirits assimilated with Earth. Of course, the vast majority of this 60% came from the Umbra, Midas, Radix, and Flora families, which were considered quite powerful in the Three Pillar sector. As for the remaining 40%, it was essentially entirely under the control of the Viola family that suddenly found itself surrounded by enemies from all sides. After this was completed, Lionel had a meeting with his grandfather about allowing some to have Earth citizenship. Lionel never asked his grandfather how he could skip over the 5-generation rule, nor did Emperor Fox seem to have any intention of explaining, but the two stubborn men surprisingly worked quite well together. Lionel granted the Oryx race full citizenship to Earth. Their current members gained about 50% of the blessings of Earth, while their next generation of children would gain all 100%. Lionel also set aside this blessing for the most loyal members of the Etching Metal organization, although they had yet to come out of seclusion, and also a few select geniuses of the Umbra, Midas, Radix, and Flora. All the while, the suffocating pressure Richard and the Viola family were experiencing only increased day after day. Lionel didn't seem to be in a rush to crush Richard at all. His first move had caused the death of many of Richard's elites and crippled him of his allyships with the chaotic water sector and the thrusting skies sector. Now, Lionel was just silently chipping away at him, sealing off his path to resources, squeezing his business dry, suffocating his lines of communication. Just 2 months after Richard's attempted sneak attack on Earth's territory, he sat in his family's throne room with a tight grip on his arm rests. At that moment, the aura of the throne seemed to be far less imposing. He couldn't remember when it had all gone wrong. No, he could. The moment he killed Lionel, it seemed that things hadn't stopped going wrong. Although he didn't want to admit it, he was being outplayed by someone. And no matter how much he hated it, that someone seemed to be Lionel himself. Richard took a breath, controlling his breathing. He had gone through too much to lose like this. Far too much. Richard opened his eyes and someone had appeared before him without even his knowledge. However, he didn't seem surprised by the appearance of this person at all. If Lionel had been there, unlike Richard, he would have been very surprised. That was because the person standing before Richard was none other than Orinik, the very same young man that had overseen his selection on planet Luxnix and the very same young man who had tried to profit off of his and Aina's death in the Dwarven race zone. What this young man who probably should have been in the Void Palace was doing here of all places was something maybe only he and the unsurprised Richard were aware of. Chapter 1834. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 40 seconds AM. Chapter 1834. Endure. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1834. Endure, you're here. Richard said lightly. Orinik gently patted down the slight wrinkles in his clothing. He was just as immaculately dressed as dressed, his robes looking like an evolved three-piece suit held together by a few chains of gold and silver. Even so, it didn't feel gaudy or nouveau riche. He carried the air of a refined gentleman, an air that was even sharper than it had been in the past now that he wasn't forced to wear the Void Palace's uniform. Orinik looked much the same as he had in the past, the only difference being that he now had a beard, which was of course perfectly groomed. What was interesting, though, was that his beard had neat strands of silver hair, a nice contrast to his dark skin. This was odd, though, since he didn't seem to have aged at the same rate as Richard. He seemed to be the same youth he was in the past. If I didn't come, wouldn't you have ruined everything? Orinik asked lightly. Richard wasn't enraged by these words, or maybe it just took more than this alone to enrage him. If you can point out to me where I've ruined everything, would actually very much appreciate it. Even now, I'm not sure where things went wrong, Richard replied. Isn't it obvious to you yet? You've been played. By who? By who else? Lionel Morales. Richard's gaze narrowed and he looked toward Orinik deeply. Explain. He eventually asked. You showed your hand too early. You're not as detached from this as you thought. If you wanted a chance for a sneak attack to work, then you should have let him trample all over you during his visit. There are no information networks that are infallible. If they hadn't been specifically looking for signs of your action because you led them like calves to the river to exactly what they needed, things wouldn't have happened like this. Or at the very least, your losses wouldn't have been so devastating. And how does the destruction of the chaotic water sector fall into all of this? Richard asked. This is something we still don't have the whole picture on, but the information released by Shield Cross Stars should be at least semi-accurate. It's just unlucky. They were destroyed before we could make use of them properly, but this is also a favor to us. The variables in Earth's territory are now at a minimum. Richard's gaze narrowed. You knew that they were of the cloud race. Not completely, but we had our speculations. Regardless, since they weren't part of the cause, they were destined to be destroyed. They were part of the previous world order, they're part of the very system that deserves to be taken down. That Guerrero's character didn't hesitate to sacrifice one of his own sons for the sake of power. What right does he have to be one of us? Orinik's expression was placid, but the sneer seemed to be clear in his voice. Then what do you want to do, exactly? We wait, Orinik said coldly. Very soon, Earth won't be able to deal properly with its own internal struggles. Richard's gaze narrowed. Weren't they destroyed? Those 4 families aren't as simple as they seem. In the Cataclysm Zone, the region I went to was under the control of the Lavis family. There's something very fishy about all of this. Those 4 families might not be human at all. Richard's pupils constricted. Not human? Not human may not be the correct way to say it. They may not be humans of our human domain is a more accurate statement. After saying this, Orinik turned and began to leave. Endure for now. Very soon, you won't have to endure any more enduring. Richard watched as Orinik vanished without a word. He too had heard inklings of those 4 families in the Cataclysm Zone. His assumption had always been that it was a marker of the end times of the human domain, a zone demarking a future where those 4 families took precedence, a zone where, much like terrain of the path, it was created to give them an opportunity to survive. This assumption seemed perfect to him, especially since the human domain was facing threats from other races. The Cloud race had already infiltrated so deeply and the others were only waiting for their opportunity to pounce. But Orinik's conclusion seemed to be different. Of them all. For some reason. Orinik seemed to be the most mysterious for reasons he couldn't net his finger on. Although Orinik had come from a family much stronger than the Viola, in the grand scheme of the human domain, they were nothing more than ants, being even weaker than the current thrusting skies sector or the former chaotic water sector. Even so, upon his return, Orinik had elevated the status of his family even faster than he had. Richard had been convinced that no one could have gained from the Cataclysm generation more than he had, but then he met Orinik. And now, Lionel seemed to have returned with a vengeance and had, according to Orinik, been leading him by the nose. Endure, huh? He had already been enduring for almost 3 decades, even a few more months wasn't a big deal to him. All he had to do was be ready when the time came. Unfortunately for Richard, Orinik wasn't the only intelligent man in existence. Lionel had known weeks ago that he had yet to destroy those 4 families completely and he knew what kind of danger they posed. So why would he let Richard survive for longer than he had to? Just when Richard thought that Lionel might try to suffocate him to death, a month later, an all-out war erupted, executing a sneak attack Richard could only dream of. In a single half-night, half of Richard's territory vanished and another quarter was swallowed up as he commanded a tactical retreat. By morning, only the 3-pillar galaxy remained. Chapter 1835. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1835. Bitter if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1835. Bitter. Lionel stood on the bow of the flagship, his gaze cold. He had yet to step onto the battlefield. All he had done was direct, and yet he without a doubt had the most blood on his hands. His commands were incisive, and often outright cruel to his enemies. A tactician who could envision a battlefield that spanned across several galaxies was definitely not one to be trifled with, and that was precisely the kind of commander that Lionel was. Whether it was on the micro level or the macro level, he took it all into account. He could avoid detrimental battlefields on scales as small as individual cities, and seek out positive battle situations on scales as large as the galaxies themselves with ease. Usually, commanders would have to delegate tasks, trusting those under them to deal with these small-scale matters. But Lionel had taken it all on his shoulders and he didn't seem to be flustered in the slightest. In fact, he seemed to still have time to enjoy the scenery around him as his nigh countless split minds all dealt with individual tasks of their own, sending information across light years. Richard sat in his throne room with his hands tightly holding onto his throne's armrests. These days, he seemed to be facing greater and greater issues with maintaining his usual calm. Before he had met Lionel and Aina, he had always been a calm and calculating individual. It was only after meeting them, and Aina in specific, that he began to lose his temper more and more frequently. And now, as though to rub this in, the moment they appeared in his life once again, it was happening once more. After a moment, Richard exhaled a breath. Every few minutes, he received reports of another loss. It was time that he joined the battlefield personally. Only like this would he be able to turn things around. But before he could step foot out of the throne room, he was blocked by a familiar figure. Richard met Orinich's gaze. You enter and exit my territory with greater ease than even I do. Don't you have a family to manage? Richard asked coldly. Orinich simply shook his head, but it was clear that he wasn't replying to Richard's question. He was taking a stance on Richard's previous actions. You're asking me to not go and support my family? Richard's gaze turned bloodshot. Now isn't the time. You'll only be going out there to die. Individual power hardly means anything on a scale like this one unless you can fit all of your assets, family members, and allies onto just a single planet. Can you do it? I don't have to do that. Richard roared, his voice losing its calmness entirely. All I have to do is kill that son of a bitch. While he's protected by a Tier 2 star flagship of Shield Cross stars? Do you like the idea of suicide that much? Richard clenched his jaw. You said I just had to endure. You said so long as I endured, I wouldn't have to endure any longer very soon. What are your words if not a useless pile of shit? My words are still the same as they were back just a month ago. Endure. We have miscalculated this matter and Lionel is a stronger opponent than we assumed him to be. Until you realize that the game has changed and some pawns have become kings, you will lose and continue to lose. Who would have thought that Lionel was returned now of all times? Not only that he would return, but even manage to steal such a weapon of war? And even worse than that, he would seemingly have returned with strength that was undefeatable within the 6th dimension and even have an ability that allowed him to battle against individuals of the 7th? Hearing these words, although Richard's eyes were still bloodshot, he was taking deep breaths. Indeed, the game had changed. Their original plans were made taking into account those 4 families and the pressure they put on Earth. But the moment Lionel had returned, he not only did so with a fierce momentum, but he directly wiped them out, destroying the knife Earth had pointed at their backs. On top of that, he seemed to now have an information network that placed the happenings of Earth's territory in the very palm of his hand. Almost nothing happened without his knowledge. Retreat, Richard. I've prepared an escape pad for you. Take your closest remaining family members, the most elite of your people, and come with me. Richard remained silent for a long time before closing his eyes. Eyes still closed, he spoke. This is what you've wanted from the very beginning, right? An ally as strong as you? Of course. Orinich replied lightly. We were already allies, Richard replied. What I mean is my lifeline being in the palm of your hands. Everything will be under your control from now on, right? If you want to see things that way, I can't stop you, Richard. But you should also understand that if you're under my leadership, not only will things run more smoothly, but I guarantee you will get your revenge, very soon, at that. In fact, the destruction of your family will only help. You cannot say that I did not give you a chance to do things on your own. I have been completely hands-off of Earth's territory and have allowed you to form alliances as you please. Have I ever tried to direct you or control what you've done? Richard was silent because he knew that the answer was no. At least in this respect, Orinich was sincere. You do not have to worry. I have a hatred for Lionel no deeper than yours, and soon, he'll also come to experience what it means to be trapped in a web of schemes he can't extricate himself from. The taste of his own medicine will be especially bitter. Richard clenched his fists and his jaw before he relaxed, his calm returned and the crimson fading from his eyes. I will follow you. Chapter 1836. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1836. Trust me, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1836. Trust me. Lionel stood over the war-torn planet Viola with the very same indifferent expression, unmoved by it all. He isn't here. These were the only thoughts Lionel had toward Richard since the start of this war. He hadn't taken the latter seriously at all. But he had predicted that there was a better than 80% likelihood that Richard would lose his temper and attempt one final all-out assault against him before he perished with the remains of his family. However, not only had Richard not done that, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. There were only two conclusions Lionel could see for this. Either Richard had evolved more as a man that he had initially given him credit for, or someone else had interfered. Almost as soon as he had these two thoughts, Lionel knew that it was the latter of the two. If he hadn't met Richard face to face already, he would have thought it to be the 30-70 toss-up, where the likelihood of the first option was 30%. But he had, so Lionel knew there was a better than 95% chance that it was the second option. The real question, though, was who would be able to steer Richard off of his path of murder and destruction. Just putting himself in Richard's shoes, Lionel knew that he would be livid. Richard had had his family destroyed once, but back then, the Luxniks had only attacked the main family branch, what meant that almost all of the Viola family's side branches had survived to live out suppressed existences. However, that had happened again, but this time in reverse, as Richard seemed to have escaped with most of his elites. In one way or another, his family had been forcefully suppressed twice over. Even a monk would find themselves at the end of their rope, let alone someone like Richard. To be talked down from a ledge, whoever this person was had to both be highly intelligent and highly respected by Richard. And, maybe most importantly, this person should be quite likely to have a close relationship with Richard. A woman? Less likely due to Richard's previous trauma related to these matters. He also didn't have a second throne in his throne room, so he's unlikely to have a wife, or at least a wife he deems to be his equal. A respected minister? Also unlikely. Those ministers of his blindly worshipped him, and they were almost all exceptionally young. If Richard said to run through a brick wall, they wouldn't hesitate. Those people wouldn't have the mind to ask him to turn around, and even if they did, Richard wouldn't listen to them. The only explanation then is that this person comes from outside of the Viola family, likely an ally or a friend, probably both given the circumstances. In that case, likely someone from the Void Palace, also likely someone who experienced similar to near identical circumstances as himself in the Cataclysm Zone. In that case, there's a better than 60% likelihood that this person is from a background that's not too powerful and also happens to have a world spirit that gave them an advantage within the Cataclysm Zone. Interesting. Lionel's gaze flickered and he turned to his right. Yuri, what families had the largest sudden boost in recent times? Yuri blinked, clearly not expecting for Lionel to suddenly ask her such a question. There are a lot. But if you mean the ones who've displayed the most improvement, there's probably only three prominent ones. One is the Viola family. Yuri cast a glance toward the planet below them. The second is the Aemon family, and the last is the Itatsi family. Aemon and Itatsi? What do you know about them? Not much. They were fairly middle of the road in the past, and they're not exactly big shots now either. It's just that their improvement is disproportionate to the amount of time that has passed. They were formerly in the bottom rung of 7th dimensional sectors, now they're nearer the middle. Is that all? There's not much other than that. There might be even weaker families than that have had larger overall improvement, but no one pays much attention to the 6th dimension given the scales of things. Lionel nodded. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't know anything about Oranic's background, because if he had, he would have recognized the Itatsi last name as being Oranic's family name. Emna. Lionel called out. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared to Lionel's left like a bolt of lightning before a young woman stepped out from its midst. Yes. Emmen, the Aemon and Itatsi families. During the expansion, tell the higher-ups to focus on the two of them. Emna's brows raised. The etching metal organization was, indeed, preparing for expansion so that they could be properly prepared for the coming heirs' wars. But originally, they were going to focus on the larger fish. This sudden pivot was unexpected. Don't worry about it, Lionel said with a wave of his hand. I have a feeling that there won't be enough time for the organization to expand adequately enough to be useful in the heir wars. Emna's brows jumped again. Not enough time. The heirs' wars wouldn't start until Lionel entered the 7th dimension. No one would even blame Lionel if he purposely delayed a bit. Even the quickest estimate was a decade, although that was a bit of a time crunch. Emna was confident that as they became more powerful with Lionel's backing, they could do it even half that time if they really went all out. So why was Lionel saying this now? Lionel smiled and didn't explain. Just trust me. Okay. Emna nodded. When Emna vanished, so too did Lionel's smile. Yuri looked toward his side profile, wondering where the naive boy of back then went. Even as this conversation came to a close, news of the unification of Earth's sector spread like wildfire. There was simply no hiding it. Lionel had only just come back, and yet Earth's turmoil, or at the very least the worst of it, had been suppressed in less than a single year. The human domain was lit ablaze. Chapter 1837. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 32 seconds AM. Chapter 1837. Peace. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1837 Peace. Just 2 chapters today, but I will upload 3 on Saturday. Earth's territory had been in shambles for a long while, only for news of its sudden stabilization to spread like wildfire. No one had ever expected that the return of a 6-dimensional prince would cause such commotion. When Noah heard the news, he could only smile somewhat bitterly. He had been back home for a long while already, but he had been entirely focused on increasing his own strength. He didn't believe that he was powerful enough to force Earth's territory into submission, so he had been trying his best to quickly reach that point. However, Lionel seemed to have flipped that notion on his head. When Noah last saw him, he was only at Tier 1, and yet he had already wiped out the 4 families. Now he was at Tier 3 and in just a few months had forced the Thrusting Skies sector to bend the knee and forced the Viola family out. If Noah knew that Lionel was also responsible for the destruction of the chaotic water sector as well, he might very well have to drink his sorrows away. He could still remember seeing Lionel that day. Despite having already stepped foot into the 7th dimension himself, he had still felt small. Maybe he really was too bogged down by tradition and doing things the right way. Lionel didn't seem to care about what made sense in the eyes of others, he simply acted to crush those who would deem to stand in his way. Noah could still remember that feeling of weakness after being captured as a slave by the people of that zone. If not for Lionel, who knows what would have happened to him? The impact of Miguel had been especially exaggerated. In fact, ever since their return to the human domain, Noah hadn't seen Miguel even once. It was impossible to tell where he had gone considering the vastness of the universe, but that was definitely a blight on his heart that he couldn't get rid of easily. The gap felt almost too large. Shield Cross stars had less complex feelings about this matter, mostly because there wasn't anything to feel other than rage. They had been booted out of Earth's territory, and just when they thought that Earth would suffer for their choice, what actually happened was its stabilization. With the contrast between the two states, how could they not be infuriated? Didn't this paint them out to be incompetent? What was even worse than this was that more and more every day, Cross Elder Avon kept getting the feeling that he was being forced to do someone else's dirty work. Guerrero's laughter at his expense still echoed in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized who benefited the most from the collapse of the chaotic water sector, and the more the image of that annoying, smiling brat appeared in his mind. He didn't want to believe it, he refused to believe it, and yet it would practically wake him up in his dreams. His temper became so poor that most simply began to avoid him entirely, and things only became worse when it became clear how difficult it would be to get any sort of information out of the Guerreros. Rather than dealing with the methods of Shield Cross stars, Guerreros simply entered a deep hibernation unique to their race, cutting off his senses from the world and burying his mind. Not only did this make him immune to torture since he couldn't feel anything, it also made probing and reading his mind nigh impossible due to the complex maze that was the Cloud race's cloud figure. The only drawback of this hibernation state was the fact that Guerreros could only rely on another member of his race to wake him up, as he couldn't do so naturally. But even so, he chose to take this route without hesitation, frustrating Avon to an extreme. This time, even the reinforced desks couldn't survive his wrath. In just a week, he went through 3 of them, each one worth tens of times the yearly revenue of a powerful 6-dimensional city. Shield Cross stars weren't the only ones frustrated, the other sectors eyeing Earth's next expansion and the remaining territories within Earth's who knew they were next were all frustrated. They had thought that they could just sit on the sidelines and reap the benefits when the time came, but reality was often cruel. The systematic oppression they faced under Lionel's leadership was suffocating, and the most shocking part was that Earth's core armies never made a single move, still silently improving themselves in the main region of Earth's territory. Lionel utilized Shield Cross-Star's flagship and many somewhat lesser quality warriors to completely rout them, leaving them no chance for retaliation. There was simply nothing to take advantage of, and those that remained within Earth's territory knew that they would be next the moment Lionel finished consolidating everything in the three-pillar sector. However, to their surprise, after crushing the rest of the Viola family's opposition and swallowing up their territories, Lionel came to a full and complete stop. Those watching from the sidelines felt their hearts go cold upon seeing this. Naton Wei Ti, Enel Niino and Norfile Hit Hick Command of the Haddlefield Wei Neenlike and Fino Thu had ever seen Hefer Van Octradius Siknften let their Nixis clan their judgment and often press too hard once they had gained an advantage, not realizing that it only took a single mistake to lose everything. Compared to others, Lionel had even more of a right to be cocky. He had subdued 2 entire sectors in just a few months, why shouldn't he feel arrogant? And yet, despite having a clear and strategic advantage, and having the momentum necessary to stake a claim onto the rest of Earth's territory, he did nothing of the sort, pulling back and retreating into the darkness in complete silence as though nothing had happened at all. However, in that silence, what rang the loudest was peace. Chapter 1838. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1838, and yet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1838 and yet. Lionel sat in silence, his thoughts unreadable. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or unsatisfied with what was going on around him despite the fact that it was a clear and undeniable victory on his part. In his mind, though, Lionel was quite unsatisfied. He didn't believe that there was anything to be happy about at all. As far as he was concerned, the moment he came back, this result was essentially inevitable. Was there a need to be happy or prideful about something that was guaranteed? It had been about half a month since the collapse of the Viola family and the etching metal organization had already begun to work on Lionel's asks. In fact, a preliminary report on those 2 families had already been given to Lionel and he had circled one very important thing. Head of the Itatsi family, Orinik Itatsi. It was a simple bit of information, one accessible to almost anyone even without such a large and robust information network. And yet, when Lionel saw it, his lip couldn't help but curl into a sneer. His relationship with Orinik couldn't be said to have started off with the latter being in the wrong. In the eyes of Orinik, Lionel was someone who had relied on his mother to gain a position that he didn't deserve, and that much was true. However, after stepping foot into the Void Palace, it was Orinik spreading this information that put the life of not only Lionel, but also Aina and the others in danger. Spreading it wasn't particularly the problem, the real issue stemmed from who he had spread it to. There was deliberate and malicious intent in his actions. Not long after that, Lionel and Aina entered the Dwarven race zone and Orinik once again took advantage of that situation in an attempt to make money off of their deaths, a choice he paid dearly for at the hands of Lionel. In reality, neither of these 2 things deserved death. Whether he had malicious intent in the first case or not didn't matter because if he chose to spread the information, it would have reached the ears of those people regardless. At the same time, when it came to the matters surrounding the Dwarven zone, just because it left a poor taste in Lionel's mouth, didn't mean that it was worthy of death either. Due to these reasons, Lionel had never really given Orinik much thought after he had gone through so much. He wasn't interested in dealing with such things anymore and he had bigger fish to fry. But to his surprise, Orinik insisted on becoming one of those bigger fish. Lionel flipped through the documents in just a few moments before setting them down. There was absolutely nothing special about them, but this was only the first round. It took time to lay down proper networks and communication paths. He didn't expect anything more than this at this stage. It should be about time that Anastasia finished. I'll see what I can find out about the Silver Empire's inheritance before the tribulation descends. When are you going to let me go? The voice knocked Lionel out of his state of focus. He looked to the side to find that Harmony had come to the bow of the ship. "You want the serious answer?" Lionel asked. "Obviously," Harmony said, annoyed. It could be said that a large part of why Lionel was able to crush so many armies with relatively average talent was because he used Harmony like his sharpest blade, sending her to all the most troublesome areas. She had done her job well, not that she had much of a choice. "Okay. You can go after I destroy the three-finger cult." Harmony's pupils constricted. The murderous intent coming off of Lionel in waves suddenly made her realize that if it wasn't for the fact he owed her sister a favor, he really wouldn't have hesitated to slaughter her in cold blood. After a moment, Harmony exhaled a breath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Even your father hasn't succeeded, let alone you." Lionel's aura receded and he chuckled as he stood to his feet. "I don't know why that old man's dragging his feet, but I guarantee it has little to do with you all. There are larger things at play. I dare to say that no one in the universe can look my old man in the eye." Harmony frowned. Wasn't Lionel too confident about things he knew nothing about? But her skepticism made sense. She had heard all sorts of disparaging remarks about the so-called cowardly Velasco from the cult. In fact, the higher-ups seemed to go out of their way to be certain that everyone knew how little they respected him. "You're talking nonsense." "Am I?" Lionel stretched out his hips, his lip curling into a smile. "In that case, why don't you ask yourself the same question in reverse?" After saying this, Lionel turned and left, leaving Harmony quite stunned. Indeed. Velasco was just one man while they were an entire organization. What pride was there in saying he couldn't take them down? Wasn't the real question to ask why it was that after all these years, they hadn't been able to kill him? Also, it wasn't as though Velasco's location was unknown. He had spent nearly 18 years, almost 2 decades, in the same spot, living in the same house, sitting on the same couch. He was entirely casual about his actions, and if he could figure out a method to enter a third-dimensional world with his strength, with the resources of the three-finger cult, why couldn't they? And yet, they hadn't even made an attempt to kill him in that time as far as Harmony was aware. During those 2 decades, Velasco couldn't practice, he had no force to absorb, no higher energies to meditate upon, no method of improvement. But they still did absolutely nothing to him. Harmony's gaze snapped back just in time to see Lionel's back view vanishing. For some reason, she felt as though her heart was pounding out of her chest. Chapter 1839. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1839. Symbiotic. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1839 Symbiotic. More chapters on the way. Just got a bit of a late start today, cough. Lionel entered the segmented cube and didn't disturb Ana. Instead, he went right to Anastasia to see what she might have found out about the inheritance until now. Quite frankly, he was quite curious. It wasn't just about the inheritance itself, but also its method of transferring its benefits. Lionel had only been in contact with a third of the inheritance for a small while, and yet it had permanently altered his heart size and shape without him even noticing. Methods on that level were far beyond Lionel's understanding. Even when it came to the tablet, Lionel could feel the transformation process, and there was even some pain involved, especially when the light and dark halves of his Northern Star lineage factor fused into one. For such sweeping changes to occur to him without even taking note of it, it was one part astonishing and another part somewhat scary. What if instead of benefits, the inheritance had been malicious? What if instead of improving the function of his heart, it added a permanent defect to it? Or what if it removed his heart entirely? These latter reasons were why Lionel chose to be cautious. If even his senses were useless in checking and monitoring the changes of this inheritance, then diving head first into it might very well be a mistake that he would never be able to extricate himself from. Any news? Lionel stepped into the lab to find a floating little girl. This inheritance is quite amazing. If what you said about the Silver Empire being a hotbed for demons was true, then this inheritance is probably the reason they were able to do it. Just taking on this inheritance would practically make someone immortal. Just the benefits of slowing your heartbeat alone would extend your life by as much as 10%. Anastasia didn't even look toward Lionel as she spoke, her gaze somewhat vacant. But Lionel was used to this. Unlike he who had to physically use the tools of the lab to get the results he wants, Anastasia was the lab and the lab was her. That vacant look in her was just her exercising her control over her surroundings, and that was made even clearer by the tools and flickering screens in the surroundings. Lionel didn't seem too surprised by Anastasia's words, though most of these were his guesses already. Plus, even back on third-dimensional Earth, the benefits of strengthening the heart and lowering one's resting heart rate were well documented. Anything groundbreaking? Everything is about what you would expect. The three parts of the inheritance come together to cause a qualitative change to the body, however the wood part of the inheritance caused the most obvious changes. More valves to the heart, larger sides, more folds in the lungs, more blood vessels, etc. The fire part of the inheritance allows you to swallow fire force and turn it into strength and vitality that support the wood part. The metal part allows you to transfer this vitality from yourself to other objects, namely metal objects, and if you're clever like the radix family, metal crafts. One part makes you a vessel. Another part strengthens the vessel. The last part allows you to share the strength of your vessel. No matter how you slice it, it's an auxiliary lineage factor designed for the express purpose of support, but what's odd is that it's not obvious at first glance what it's trying to support. The fire part makes sense, but the transfer to metal objects part feels entirely arbitrary. Why does the fire part make sense? Fire has and always will be the foundation of life. It was the first invention. Without its existence, without its warmth, there wouldn't be life as we know it. It could be said that it's even more fundamental in this regard than life force. Lionel frowned when he heard this. It sounded like some nonsense you would read in a book, or some legend about a man like Prometheus. But the way he saw it, the root of fire would always be destruction. It was designed to burn, to combust. Warmth came not from fire, but from the stars, and stars were decidedly not flames. They were nuclear reactors that took advantage of the exothermic output of volatile chemical reactions. Life could exist without fire, in fact existence might be better off without it in some respect. But it couldn't make do without stars. If Anastasia had said the same thing about water force, he would have tended to believe her a little bit more. But for fire force, one just needed to look at the number one fire force in all of existence to understand. How could the embodiment of destruction be the number one fire force in all of existence if fire force was the representation of life? It didn't compute. If I had to guess why metal was chosen, it's likely because its root is earth force. Earth force is a great stabilizing force and it can ensure balance. This ties in with the transferring of vitality quite well as well, as it won't allow your body to become overloaded with life force that you cannot handle. As such, it allows you to offload some of that weight to another VQYYYY8 object. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Metal as a stabilizing force. Hold on, earth force isn't necessarily entirely disconnected from life. There are real minerals and metals within the human body that have to reach a certain level to maintain one's health. Tron, zinc, copper, magnesium, sodium, the list goes on and on. Earth force is probably even more important to survival and life force than fire force could ever be. That sort of symbiotic relationship between organic and inorganic. Lionel's body trembled and he seemed to have comprehended something. His bronze aura triggered outside of his control, but the dazed look in his eyes made it clear and obvious that he didn't notice at all. Lionel's aura rose like a gentle tide, a far cry from the sudden burst he had experienced at the Umbra family. Even so, he crossed a major threshold, entering Tier 4. Chapter 1840. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1840, Slow and Steady? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1840 Slow and Steady? Lionel's progress was like a gentle tide, his aura like the warm embrace of the first rays of sun in the morning. The way Lionel looked at his divine armor and metal body felt different now. They didn't feel like extensions of himself granted by his lineage factor, rather they felt more like fundamental aspects of his being, and he even somewhat regretted how he had constructed them now. If he had this knowledge before, his approach would have been slightly different. However, unlike how he might have reacted to this in the past, Lionel didn't panic now, and his usual feelings of missing out weren't there. That was because due to his new mindset, he was extraordinarily confident that he would be able to fix it. His divine armor and metal body weren't rigid, immovable constructs. They were him just as he was them. If one wanted to change the composition of metals in their body, there were all sorts of methods even a third-dimensional human could use, let alone Lionel, who was now in Tier 4 of the 6th dimension and had a lineage factor specifically tailored for this. Now, Lionel was even more certain that the lineage factor of the Morales family was tied with the lineage factor of the Silver Empire. He felt that Anastasia was correct. The lineage factor was preparing a person's body for something, and that something was the metal synergy lineage factor. He was over 70% certain of this. The only questions that remained were related to how things had come about like this. Why was the preparation lineage factor not in the hands of the Morales? With it, they would have the only 9th-dimensional lineage factor in the human domain, that was guaranteed, no one could convince otherwise. Even if by some anomaly Lionel was wrong and this inheritance wasn't designed to help the metal synergy lineage factor, the truth of the matter was that it would still raise the latter to the standard of a 9th-dimensional lineage factor whether they were related or not. The two were simply far too compatible. Then there were the other obvious questions. What was the relationship of the Morales with the Silver Empire? And no, even deeper than that, the Three-Finger Cult? Was this related to the death of his grandfather? He could feel that the demoness could sense him whenever he thought about her. It was the uncomfortable feeling of someone looking over his shoulder while he was trying to do work, scrutinizing his every action. If she wanted, Lionel felt that she could learn everything she wanted to learn about him in an instant, so why hadn't she done anything yet? Could it be that she wanted this inheritance to fall into his hands? Could she be indifferent to it all? Could it be that she was afraid to take action because of his father? Even for Lionel, he felt like he was getting a headache thinking about it. Nothing felt like it made sense. The jumbled mess of enemies, friends, frenemies, all seemed far too complex for even him to untangle. Lionel opened his eyes and exhaled. However, he was surprised to find that Anastasia was looking at him with a weird look in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Lionel asked. "People aren't supposed to be able to break through like that." "Like what? Isn't this how the 6th dimension works?" "My path isn't exactly like the God path, but it works similarly enough. So long as I comprehend my forces, I progress." "Yes, but it's not like that. You're making massive leaps in logic, accepting them easily, integrating them, and then breaking through in the blink of an eye. Normally, one needs to have an idea, affirm it, test it, then meditate on it for a few weeks to months before consolidating and then finally breaking through. The only person I've seen break through like you is that annoying man." Lionel grinned, already knowing she was talking about his old man. "What's even weirder is that you don't seem to be using the same forces to break through, and you also aren't using a cultivation method of any kind. You did the same thing through the 5th dimension too. You didn't even use dimensional cleanse until you needed to redo the 5th dimension and break through." Lionel raised an eyebrow. "How did you know that? You weren't there for that." "My vessel is an extension of me. Although I wasn't there, my vessel was still on your finger the whole time. After I fused with it again, its memories also fused with me." "I see," Lionel said lightly. "Is there something wrong with what I'm doing?" "Not really, but it relies a lot on spontaneity, something that can't be relied on. If you don't learn to do things the slow way, it might come back to bite you, or you could be like that annoying man and never need the slow way anyway. Just now, if your comprehension of Earth Force didn't leapfrog your comprehension of Dream Force, you wouldn't have seen much movement. And because it relied on a spontaneous comprehension, your forces are imbalanced again. It works for you, for now at least, because you have high affinity in a number of forces, so those spontaneous comprehensions have more potential paths to take. But when you reach a state whether your affinities start lagging behind your dimensional tier, it'll be hard to tell what will happen. You may fall behind those who took slower and steadier steps. Lionel nodded. I understand. But there is one thing you're missing, my ability index. Anastasia fell into her thoughts and nodded once. Indeed, so-called slower and steadier steps look a lot faster for Lionel simply by virtue of how his mind worked and the speeds it functioned at. Still, keep this in mind, Anastasia said. Lionel nodded. I'll be going now. I was wondering if it was worth it to put in the effort to gain this full inheritance, but I feel that there's no doubt now. I have to have it. Chapter 1841. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1841. Restrictions: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1841 restrictions. Not long later, Lionel sat in the midst of the meditating youths of the Radix, Midas and Florer. He seemed to have entirely forgotten about the world around him. Although he was very much present, those who looked at him felt as though he wasn't there at all. Every few minutes, his aura would shift slightly and the mysterious well of force that surrounded him only became deeper. Lionel stood in the middle of a world of golden trees, flaming skies and dense rivers of bronze. He walked across the bronze rivers, crossing by the golden trees and feeling the heat of flaming skies above his head. This was the now complete world, of which he had only seen a portion of before. Last time he was here, there was no ground and no sky, only the trees of gold. But now, the world was truly complete and every step he took felt like he was being baptized by an odd energy. What was interesting though was that Lionel didn't feel that it was very difficult at all. The bronze river should have made his legs heavy, but other than a small slowdown, he experienced no other hardships. The golden trees continuously flooded his body with vitality, trying to test to see where his limits lay, but he continuously broke through them as though they didn't exist in the first place. The flaming skies above were supposed to burn his skin, to scorch his will through, to raise him down to nothing more than a pile of ashes, but compared to the three other challenges, this one was by far the easiest. He had 2 Scarlet Star Force innate nodes within his body. How could normal flames hope to burn him? As he walked forward, the bronze rivers rushed with more vigor, the golden trees shone with more vitality, and the normal flames in the skies became something even more sinister than that. But Lionel only continued to walk forward without the slightest pause. In the outside world, Lionel's once gentle breath became like hurricane-force winds. He didn't seem to be trying very hard, and yet all of the air and the surrounding hundreds of meters surged toward him uncontrollably. Without a choice, the elders could only evacuate the children in the vicinity. They had yet to see such an exaggerated result from meditating on the inheritance, but they had seen somewhat similar results before. Somewhere deep inside, they had hoped that Lionel's results wouldn't be as successful as theirs, in one part due to selfishness, and another part due to them wanting to maintain their usefulness to him. But after seeing this, they knew for a fact that Lionel was simply on a different level. Even the 2 most talented among them, Gray and Magaron, took weeks to reach this level, but Lionel had only been here for a few minutes. Golden flames suddenly took life and danced across Lionel's skin before being absorbed by him and vanishing. Lionel's hair began to grow out to exaggerated length. Soon it had pooled so much that his body could hardly be seen. It was quite a beautiful sight, just endless strands of filaments exuding a gentle pale purple light. It looked like the hair of a deity. At the same time, Lionel's bronze aura appeared once again, becoming thicker and thicker until it bordered an almost dark mustard to dark gold color. It solidified to the point it looked almost as though Lionel had gotten a harsh spray tan that didn't complement him well at all. But then it infused into his skin and seemed to vanish entirely. Just when it vanished, Lionel took another step within the trial world and it appeared again in the outside world, this time rippling outward with wild abandon. This time, however, the bronze aura had gained a tinge of a violet light to it, making it look particularly royal and majestic. This violet hue only continued to grow. Right then, in the depths of Lionel's blood, the faint outline of a sixth set of doors began to form. Across the universe, in the depths of the Morales family hold land, 3 mountain-sized incense sticks continued to burn with a gentle light as the elders meditate in silence, the commotion of the world seemingly having nothing at all to do with them. Until, all at once, their eyes opened with a sudden forcefulness. Boom! The outline of a 9-layered door appeared in the skies of the Holy Land, and the Morales family elders watched with trembling hearts. They had never seen such a phenomenon before, but inwardly they all knew what it was. The 6th door. The 5th door of the Morales family had always been a tightly held secret. No one but their most talented knew that their lineage factor had the potential to enter the 8th dimension. However, none of them had known that a 6th door was possible. They had no idea where this door was coming from, and the aura was far too wild and volatile to lock down its location. But all of them still thought of just a single man. They couldn't fathom it being anyone other than Velasco, that man who broke all laws of common sense on his whim. Could it be that he had finally found a path to enter that legendary realm? Could it be that he had finally broken the shackles of the 8th dimension that had bound this universe? Had he finally beaten the regular at its own game? The elders all looked up with shimmering gazes, their hearts practically pounding out of their chest. At this point, even the restrictions of this holy land couldn't block out this aura, and it began to leak, enveloping the human domain and even crossing the barrier into other domains. Lionel continued to sit in silence. In the depths of his bloodline, the 4th door and all of its 9 tiers were nearly blown off its hinges. A door he should have only been able to open when he entered the 7th dimension with his metal body couldn't withstand his blazing aura for even a few short moments, its shackles shattering to pieces. Chapter 1842. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1842. Bow heads if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1842. Bow heads. Lionel's aura continued to blaze, the 5th door nearly flying from its hinges a moment later. Only then did Lionel's momentum begin so slow before coming to a gentle stop, standing beneath the looming presence of the 6th door. The metal synergy lineage factor was the only one Lionel knew of that had steps to its progress like this. As a result, it couldn't display its full player until it reached a certain point. Lionel could still remember hard being able to manipulate Earth force to change his surroundings when he entered the Void Palace, and that was because back then, he had only opened up the 2nd door. How could he manipulate a 7th-dimensional world, especially one under the influence of anarchic force, when his metal synergy lineage factor was only opened up to the 5th dimension? Of course, things weren't exactly that simple. Despite its supposed weakness, the metal synergy bloodline, especially thanks to its supplemental skills like metal body and divine armor, matched up well and even dwarfed many lineage factors when facing enemies at the same level. But now, Lionel had blown by the usual convention of the metal synergy lineage factor, awakening it to the 8th dimension in just a single step. In an instant, it had gone from one of his weaker lineage factors, at least in terms of raw power and ignoring its supplemental techniques, to one of his absolute strongest. Lionel exhaled a breath, causing winds of such force to manifest that the walls and the surroundings cracked and threatened to collapse the entire building. Lionel opened his eyes slowly, a dense light shooting out of them. When he saw the state of his surroundings, his gaze narrowed for a moment before he waved a hand. At that moment, a wave of earth force took shape and the cracks and damages to the foundation were healed in the blink of an eye. Lionel took another breath and realized he was breathing far too hard and adjusted himself accordingly. Others might take days, weeks, or even months to properly adjust themselves to new strength, but Lionel took only a handful of seconds before it was all reined in. With a hand, Lionel grabbed at his hair and cut it short once more before storing it and standing to his feet. Lionel looked toward the inheritance and his gaze narrowed. Whether it was the chalice, the flame, or the wood ball, all of them had greatly dimmed. It seemed there was a limit to the number of times these treasures could pass on the full inheritance. Lionel wasn't sure if they would recover with time, or if this was permanent, but there was already nothing much he could do to change things. Lionel ruffled his hair and turned to leave. He had a feeling that something big would happen quite soon. Unfortunately this time, it was probably his fault. This change would catalyze a lot of things to happen on a faster timeline than he thought might otherwise happen. This was fine, though. Now he felt even more confident about certain things. Even on a slower timeline, there was no guarantee he would be able to reach this level of strength. %% as Lionel thought, the sudden burst of an aura that transcended anything they had ever felt before coming directly from the Morales family had made many feel as though they were standing on tenterhooks. It only made things worse that Lionel's appearance had completely stabilized the situation in Earth's territory, ruining any chance outside influences had to take advantage of the situation. The momentum of the Morales family felt too fierce. Not only did the races outside the human domain want to stifle it, but so too did even humans themselves. As wise Star Order had said, humans were simply too divided. In such a volatile world, any other race facing this sort of existential crises would have long since come together. In fact, this wasn't just speculation. Not long ago, something very similar had happened to the Dwarven race after their first eighth-dimensional world appeared. They had pulled themselves together and fought tooth and nail before succeeding in defending their territory. And what were humans doing? They had yet to pick out a leader. Earth was on the verge of entering the eighth dimension any time now, and it was already obvious that other races were making their moves, but they were more worried about the Morales family gaining too much power too suddenly. Within the Atatsi family, Orinik sat in a courtyard sipping some tea. To his side there was Richard and an unknown young man, or at the very least, he was unknown to most of the world as he had only just come onto the scene. He was none other than the current head of the Amon family, Montero. They all looked up into the skies when they sensed the aura, their expression frighteningly serious. They fell into silence for a long while, no one speaking for as much as half an hour until an attendant ran in and respectfully handed Orinik a summary report. When Orinik finished reading, he passed it to the other two and smiled lightly. It seems that this time came sooner than I thought it would. We just need to make a subtle little push. What do you intend to do? Montero asked. It's simple, really. The Morales family needs to be knocked down a peg. Lionel Morales needs to be knocked down a peg. Earth needs to be knocked down a peg. There's just one obvious choice, the heirs' wars. Richard and Montero frowned. Seeing their reactions, Orinik chuckled. You two look at the heirs' wars too simply. This isn't just a stage for the Morales family to pick a successor. Why do you think the Constellation families do not participate? It's because they too know that it means more than just a few juniors fighting it out. If the Constellation families participated, it wouldn't just be a friendly clash to pick out the heir with the best future potential, it would instead be a domain war of the human domain. The hearts of the two men skipped a beat. So you want to? Well, we don't really need to do much at all, we just need to plant some seeds. Despite the talent of the other heirs, the one everyone fears the most is Lionel. If the Morales family ends up in his hands, it won't be long before the human domain is ruled by them, and there are too many who don't want to see that day come. You want to force the Morales family to hold the heir wars ahead of time. Orinik's lip curled. Just the act of holding it before they want to will be a slap to their face. It will slow their momentum and humiliate them on a world stage. In addition, because Lionel has yet to enter the seventh dimension, and lost 20 years of preparation, his loss is almost guaranteed. Once he loses the right to lead the Morales family. Well, I will keep some things to myself for now. Will the Morales family bow to such pressure, though? Richard asked. You're still too naive, Orinik laughed. There is no absolute power in the human domain, even in regards to the Morales family. Will they bow their hands? Haven't they done so already once before? Why do you think Velasco isn't the patriarch of the Morales family right now? You can't really believe he just didn't want such power, right? The eyes of the two young men opened wide. The two couldn't help but look toward one another, seeing the clear shock in one another's eyes. %% in a distant place across the universe, Velasco looked up from teasing his wife, his gaze narrowing. In the end, in a rare moment of solemnity, he sighed. However, his sigh had nothing to do with the pressure the Morales family would soon face. That demoness sunk her claws into my son. His gaze became frighteningly cold. He didn't sound like a man that was ignorant of the Silver Empire's inheritance at all. But oddly enough, he didn't seem to be worried about Lionel using it either, and yet he was enraged, no, more accurately annoyed. As for why, maybe only he and a select few knew. Chapter 1843. Published at 8th of May 2023 10:37 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 1843. Pretentious. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1843. Pretentious. The Morales family was incredibly complex in structure. One didn't need to be a genius to understand this, just knowing that they had over 1 billion youths born into the Nova generation was enough to necessitate this. Also, these were just the number of youths that had awakened at least one of their lineage factors and couldn't represent the total number of youths born into this generation as a whole. If there were so many born into just a single generation, then it was all too clear just what kind of scale the Morales family was on. Things only became more complex in recent times due to the 20-year time dilation. Because of the circumstances, the next generation of youths, the post-Nova generation, had already been born. Usually, these youths would be gearing up for their own air wars in just another decade or so, but they had ended up unlucky in this regard. With the Nova generation having yet to claim its patriarch, the post-Nova generation might never get a chance to. It also didn't help that while the number of heirs to the Nova generation was much larger than previous years at 7, the post-Nova generation actually had even more, with 9 awakening 2 lineage factors. To the Morales family, this was actually a good problem to have. With so many talents, the elders spent their days smiling so wide that their wrinkles seemed to have entirely smoothed out. But to the rest of the world, this was just another item on the checklist of reasons the Morales family had to be suppressed. Their momentum was too great and it only seemed to be growing more and more every day. Orinik was a lot of things, but a fool wasn't one of them. At the very least, he was correct that there was only so much idling the remainder of the human domain would continue to do, and Lionel would seem to be the catalyst for many of these things. The current patriarch of the Morales family was a man who went by Alejandro Morales. He was the father of First Nova, Adworth, and a man known for his calm temperament and even-keeled approach to things, a far cry from the usual madman the Morales family placed in power. It could be said that it was thanks to Alejandro that the Morales family hadn't been dissected by their enemies. His calm approach to diplomacy had eased a lot of the tension and bad blood that had been caused by the previous air war. There was no doubt that he was a well-respected man who didn't easily display his emotions on his face, but on this day he had a dark cloud hanging over his head, both figuratively and literally. Those who thought of Alejandro as a calm, and even-keeled man had never met him in his youth. He had been forced to train himself to control his temper because whenever he lost it, a black cloud would appear above him just like this one. If those in his vicinity were lucky, he would be able to keep it to this relatively small and miniature size. If they were unlucky, or rather were stupid enough to keep provoking him, this dark cloud would spin entirely out of control and destroy everything in its path. Alejandro had a very rare weather control ability index and he had elevated it to Tier 4, which allowed him to create his own atmosphere. This meant he no longer needed to rely on the atmosphere of a planet or a moon to display his ability index. At this level, if he lost control of his temper, an entire solar system could be embroiled in a storm, let alone a single planet. Clearly, he had been so low-key over these last few decades that everyone had forgotten. What other explanation could there be for them to provoke him like this again and again? The Morales family had a lot of turnover at the patriarch position, usually changing every 20 to 30 years at most. This was because their personalities were very suited to leadership to begin with. They were all much too hot-blooded. Alejandro had managed to rein in his temper because he thought he would only have to endure 2 decades of this bullshit, come to find out that his position would be extended by another 2 decades on top of that. He was already reaching the end of his fuse, and then this nonsense kept coming on his desk again and again. Fuck. Boom. The cloud above his head released a resounding clap of thunder that sent a powerful sound wave in all directions. The window shattered, the walls cracked, the very foundation of the building quaked. Adderworth, who was sitting across from his father, slowly lowered his palms from his ears. Clearly, he had been prepared ahead of time, although the result was still jarring. "I don't want to read this shit anymore, read it to me." Alejandro threw over a large pile of letters and leaned back in his chair with an annoyed expression, bringing out a cigar. Adderworth shook his head, but eventually still opened up the next one and cleared his throat. "Greetings from the Leo family. We are concerned that with the coming race war, the Morales family will be leaderless while moving into this new era. The position of patriarch of the Morales family is one that changes the direction of the whole of the human race. It is best if this is no longer delayed, as it would only be a detriment to the human domain. In proving that we of the Leo family are properly invested in this matter, we are willing to send juniors to participate as well. We are committed to boom." Alejandro's desk shattered. His fuse was really short these days, he had no patience for any of it. Tell them to go fuck themselves. They must really think him a pushover. Fuck, let me see that letter, I want to see the handwriting. If I don't kick the ass of the bastard who wrote the pretentious pile of shit, I'm going to explode. Adderworth could only speechlessly hand the letter over to his father. Chapter 1844. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 21 seconds AM. Chapter 1844. Excellent. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1844. Excellent. I knew it was that bastard Van Uzi. He's the only one of those pricks who thinks himself to be a scholar despite having the IQ of a pile of shit from a donkey's ass. Adderworth's lip twitched. The world hadn't seen his father's foul mouth in too long, so they had clearly forgotten. But he and his mother were all too well aware, they could only allow the man to rant. So, Adderworth did so until Alejandro seemed to have finally run out of breath. "We're going to have to do it anyway, Dad." Alejandro looked toward his son with bloodshot eyes as though he could swallow him whole. For a second, he saw a reflection of himself 40 years ago, back when he still had the patience to remain calm. The apple didn't fall too far from the tree, so Alejandro knew all too well that his son had a temper no less fiery than his own. It was just that the two had bothered to learn how to control it, unlike many of the others. Even so, he felt like he wanted to take a bite out of his son's head right now, even though he knew that he was correct. There were certain things that had to be done in the name of keeping the peace. If a family only knew how to move forward and never took a step back, things could easily reach a point of no return. However, the goal of these people was too infuriating. Holding the Air Wars was for no other purpose than to suppress Lionel. Even 6th Nova, Valor, had now stepped into the 7th dimension after so long at the peak of the 6th. The youths of the Cataclysm generation were also taking that step one after another. The only one at a decidedly cruel disadvantage was Lionel. This was infuriating on multiple fronts. For one, the Morales family had no desire to suppress one of their own. And secondly, these actions were like the world saying that his own son was inferior. Even if he was inferior to Velasco, did his son not get a chance to at least prove himself before the world decided that he couldn't match up to the former son? This enraged Alejandro just as much as anything else. But even a step beyond this, it was clear that the greatest goal here, especially with the Constellation families insisting on taking part, was to kill Lionel. Even in the case that they didn't kill him, it was to at least knock him down a peg, to crush his confidence, maybe even to do him harm that he couldn't heal from, to cripple him. This was the underlying motivation of all of this, and they were asking Alejandro to sanction it. To them, if so many families were participating at once, it would be impossible for Velasco to target all of them, not to mention the fact that it would only be the juniors participating to begin with. Lionel's life wasn't what was truly important here, it was his connection with Earth. If a Prince of Earth became the patriarch of the Morales family, what that meant and represented was on a completely different level than the current status quo. The Morales family would have every right to move in and monopolize the whole of Earth. This was something the other families could not allow, and as such, Lionel couldn't be allowed to continue pressing forward and growing at his own leisurely pace. With everything laid out like this, there was little the others could do. If the Morales family was firm in rejecting this, then the one to suffer the most would be Lionel. Those families had taken this approach for the sake of maintaining a faint veil of cordiality. If the Morales rejected, then it was just another step towards shedding all pretenses, and they would have to be ready to war with the whole of the human domain. That doesn't mean we have to roll over either, Adderworth said with a smile. Alejandro, who was already annoyed, just rolled his eyes. Just get to the point, you're so long-winded. I swear you get it from your mo. Alejandro immediately stopped and cleared his throat. His eyes darted around and he only breathed a sigh of relief after he realized his wife wasn't here. He had almost forgotten himself as he lost his temper. That could have ended very badly. Adderworth raised an eyebrow but just chuckled in the end. Since they want to participate, let them participate. But not as supporters, but as heirs themselves. Since they like to think themselves capable of suppressing our family, I'd like to see what they can do when they're forced to be on a stage with us. Alejandro slammed his palms on the table. Excellent. Firstly, this could be packaged as an event separate from the heirs' wars, although it would functionally still be the heir wars. Due to this, the hit the Morales family took to their reputation would be minimized. Secondly, it would give the Morales family heirs a chance to completely suppress the heirs of the other families and crush them one by one, thus mitigating the blow to their reputation even further. In fact, there was even an opportunity to gain reputation. And thirdly, maybe the best part of all, due to the fact these participating heirs would have to gather up their own cohorts and supporters now, it would delay the matter for some time. It would take them a while before they were confident enough to match up their own cohorts with that of the Morales family heirs. Of course, this might leave room for the heirs to be backstabbed, so there was some risk involved. If the Morales heirs people weren't trustworthy enough and had ties to other powerful families, it would be easier to suddenly find yourself without any support in the end at all. This was a double-edged sword that had to be baked into this event, or else the other families would never agree. If the Morales heirs had all the advantages, wouldn't the rest only be appearing to be humiliated? It seemed that during his reign, the world had forgotten to fear the Morales. In that case, Alejandro would let the juniors remind them first before the old fogies like himself stepped in. Chapter 1845. Published at 8th of May 2023, 10:37 and 20 a.m. Chapter 1845, Arrogant. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The reply of the Morales was surprisingly calm, but the reaction to it was anything but. There was only one word the human domain had to describe it. Arrogant. The release Alejandro made was quite simple. He accepted the terms of the other families. He said that he would happily welcome the families of the human domain to participate in their heir wars. In fact, he was a bit surprised that none had ever requested to in the past. He felt that the youths of the human domain could have learned a lot from their previous generations, and he was happy that they would finally start with the Nova generation. These words alone were a clear gauntlet thrown. He might as well have stepped out and slapped each one of their faces individually, and yet he had done it with a genial smile on his face and without the slightest hint of anger in his tone. However, this was only the very beginning. Alejandro's statement continued. In commemoration of this change, the Morales family had decided to change things up. They would open up the heir wars zone to all of the heirs of the human domain. Anyone, regardless of background, could sign up to be an heir. The only requirement was that one had to display strength equivalent to a sector-ranked disciple of the Void Palace and had to have at least 3 seventh-dimensional existences willing to subordinate themselves to you. The only other catch was that these seventh-dimensional existences could not be older than 100 years old. Just these rules alone cut off the path of many people. It had to be remembered that Richard was already in his 70s when Lionel first met him, and yet he had only been at Tier 9 of the 5th dimension. In addition, he had been in what could be considered a family at the very pinnacle of the 6th dimension. So, these rules cut off the opportunity to a lot of people. But from the very beginning, the Morales were only interested in teaching the families capable of pressuring them a lesson. This wasn't a free-for-all. The Air Wars Zone wasn't just a place of battle, it was also one of the Morales family's greatest resources. This couldn't be casually opened up to outsiders just because. In his concluding statements, Alejandro said that this would be the first domain-wide air wars in their history, so he hoped that the other families would show their sincerity. As rewards, the Morales family would be putting up not only their various body-tempering pools on the line, but they also placed a chance to meditate within their holy land as one of their top prizes. This news alone unleashed a reign of chaos. Everyone knew that the Morales family body-tempering pools were the best in the whole of the human domain, and maybe even in the whole of the universe. They were divided into several grades. There were their common pools, their elite pools, their divine pools, and finally their transcendent pools. To put into perspective just how valuable these pools were, just take the common pools for example. By soaking in the common pool just once a week, one could reach the 7th dimension in the conventional path in just 10 years while doing no other training. And that was just the common pool. The elite pool could have this same effect in just 1 year. The divine pool could have this same effect in just 1 month. The transcendent pool could allow this result in just a single dip. The shocking value of such a thing didn't need to be explained. While the Morales family only had just 3 transcendent pools, their number of common pools could be counted in the tens of thousands. There was a reason they held nigh untouchable prowess within the human domain. Even so, the body-tempering pools paled in comparison to the Holy Land, or more accurately, the breath of incense one could inhale within the Holy Land. Breathing in these fumes would help one enter a state of enlightenment. Although there would be diminishing returns every time one inhaled these fumes, it was said that during the first time, depending on how deep your immersion, you might be able to break through several tiers at once along the God path. This was akin to the difference between heaven and earth. Lionel breaking through 2 stages at once was enough to leave the Umbra family, who had the 3-finger cult as a reference, in complete and utter shock. However, the breath of incense within the Morales family's holy land could induce similar results. Usually, the geniuses of the Morales family would delay their first inhalation for the longest period of time possible. The further they could make it first, the more valuable the first inhalation. There were even records of those with the best results crossing 3 and very rarely 4 tiers at once within the 7th dimension. A single tier divide within the 7th dimension, especially along the God path, was even larger than the gap between Tier 1 and Tier 9 of the 6th dimension. And yet, this single inhalation could allow such a chance. The Morales family was very clearly forcing the hands of the other powerful families. They wanted to play games and poke the bear, right? Well, in that case, if they wanted to even have the face to participate in these heirs wars, they had better bring out the best treasures they had, or else they would be laughed out of the room before they even had a chance to catch their breath. Alejandro had laid down a very heavy gauntlet. In 3 months' time, they would hold a conference on planet Morales to iron out the rules of the domain air wars. In addition, by then, these families were to have their list of participants and the treasures they would be putting up prepared. The Morales family had made their move and the chessboard seemed to have been flipped. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.